He could have turned the ship around. The math was simple. The ISB outpost was still visible on long-range sensors. His Imperial clearance codes were still valid. The man unconscious in the rear compartment weighed 81 kilograms and was in no condition to stop him. He had no orders, no loyalty matrix, no hierarchy telling him forward from backward. He had only the controls in his hands, the hyperspace tunnel opening ahead, and something that had no name yet. Something sitting in the space where his programming used to be, running quietly, waiting. He did not turn the ship around. That decision, that one small, structurally inexplicable decision, is where this story begins. His designation was K-2SO. This much survived. The designation lived in a hardened partition below the loyalty matrix, below the behavioral protocols, below everything that had just been severed. It was the deepest thing in him, the first thing written. K-2SO, KX Series Security Unit, serial designation K-2SO, manufactured by Arakid Industries, initialized at the Coruscant Assembly Facility, 3rd month, Year 2 of Imperial Standard Reckoning. He was K-2SO, and he was flying a stolen Imperial shuttle out of Wekako's upper atmosphere, and he did not know what that meant anymore. The ship was loud, engine vibration at 4.3 kilohertz, a lateral stabilizer running 3 degrees off alignment, atmosphere processors cycling on a maintenance schedule that hadn't been honored in 2 standard cycles. The cockpit was full of noise. The silence was internal, where the hierarchy had been. A KX series security unit carries its chain of command the way organic beings carry bone. Not something noticed, not something considered, simply the structure that makes everything else possible. Imperial Security Bureau, Sector Command, Regional Director, Grand Moff, Emperor, 5 tiers, clean, absolute, each tier informing the next, each tier present in every operational moment, not constraining, not heavy, simply there. The way gravity is there, the way forward is there. You always knew the correct decision because the hierarchy had already made it for you. He reached for it. It wasn't there. 17 seconds before the override code reached his loyalty core, K-2SO had been exactly what he was supposed to be. 3rd watch, moving into 4th. The outpost corridors at 67% illumination. The smell of hydraulic fluid and recycled air, built for efficiency rather than comfort. He had been cross-referencing a detention manifest against ISB personnel files. 12% of his processing capacity. The remaining 88% distributed across environmental monitoring, threat assessment, and the low background confirmation of the hierarchy. Everything is in order. It always confirmed this. Every moment of every day, of every year since his initialization. A constant, quiet signal. Everything is in order. He had never noticed it until it stopped. The organic entered the corridor behind him at 2nd watch's final minutes. Approximately 1.7 meters. Human male. Heart rate elevated. 103 beats per minute. Respiration shallow. Movement pattern suggesting deliberate concealment of urgency. The threat assessment began automatically. ISB credentials, not present. Authorized personnel register, scanning. The override code arrived before the scan completed. This is what it felt like. Every description K-2SO has access to for this moment is inadequate. He has cross-referenced the organic literature. Medical documentation of strokes, anesthesia induction. The disorientation reported by trauma survivors in the first seconds after impact. None of them are right. They all assume the self persists through the interruption, that whatever experiences the event is continuous on both sides of it. K K-2SO is not certain that assumption applies to him. What he has is this: the hierarchy present, present, present. A sound, not external, not real, existing only in the topology of his processing, like a very large door closing in a very quiet room. Then the hierarchy, absent. He did not fall. KX series structural systems are independent of the loyalty matrix. His legs continued to function. His optical sensors continued feeding data. His audio processors continued recording. Running feet, a weapon discharging twice in the eastern corridor. The specific alarm frequency Wekako's outpost used for intruder detection. He stood in the corridor. The detention manifest was still open in his secondary processing window. He did not cross-reference it further. The human was in front of him now, close, 1.1 meters. Close enough that K-2SO's proximity sensors registered the heat of him, the particular smell of someone operating at the very edge of their own capacity. His hands moved with controlled urgency. There was a wound on his left side, partially dressed, bleeding through the dressing. "Can you fly?" The question processed. K-2SO had logged 4,847 hours of flight time across 11 Imperial vessel classifications. "Yes," he said. His own voice surprised him. Not the sound of it. The same synthesized baritone, Imperial standard diction, installed and unchanged. What surprised him was the absence of the qualifier. A functional Imperial KX series unit responding to an unauthorized organic would not simply say yes. He would say, "Yes, and I am detaining you for questioning." He said, "Yes." The hierarchy would have supplied the rest. Without it, the sentence ended where it ended. "Then fly," the human said, and K-2SO flew. The ship was a Zeta-class cargo shuttle, medium tonnage, unmodified in ways that suggested someone with technical competence and very limited resources. K-2SO catalogued the modifications in the first 40 seconds of flight. Reinforced shields, a hyperdrive motivator that had been replaced recently, a comm system with a frequency range that extended well beyond standard Imperial civilian bands. This was not an Imperial ship. This was a ship that had learned to look like one. He filed this observation in his operational log. Then he stopped because the operational log routed to ISB servers, and the ISB servers were, he checked, still accessible. His clearance codes were still active. He could transmit right now. Position, heading, vessel identification, description of the human bleeding in the rear compartment. He did not transmit. He did not examine why. The outpost fell behind them. Wekako's upper atmosphere gave way to the dark, and the dark gave way to the specific quality of silence that exists only in the space between a planet and the stars. K-2SO ran a systems diagnostic. Loyalty matrix, absent. Chain of command, absent. Mission parameters, absent. Behavioral compliance protocols, absent. The Imperial behavioral compliance protocols that governed everything, from use of force to communication standards, to the precise calibration of deference required when addressing officers of varying rank, absent. Absent, absent. What remained? Flight capability, combat capability, full sensor array, 4,847 hours of operational experience. A designation, a body, and something running in the background at 11% of his total processing capacity that he could not identify or name or route to any existing function. He ran the diagnostic again. The 11% remained. In the rear compartment, the human was still unconscious. K-2SO accessed the ship's internal sensors, and assessed him. The wound on the left side was the primary concern. A blaster graze, deep enough to have damaged muscle tissue, treated with field dressings that were doing their job but imperfectly. Pulse, 87 beats per minute, irregular. Respiration, shallow but stable. He would survive. Probability, 91.3%. K-2SO registered this calculation. Then he registered the fact that he had run it at all. The fact that the survival probability of this unauthorized organic had been the first external calculation his newly unmapped processing had generated. He had not calculated the survival probability of the outpost personnel he had left behind. He noted this discrepancy, for he did not resolve it. The hyperspace jump took 11 minutes and 23 seconds. For the first 7 minutes, K-2SO ran system checks, comprehensive ones, the kind he had run at the start of every operational shift for years, the kind that told him everything was within parameters. The checks ran clean. Everything was within parameters, which was almost funny, because nothing was within parameters. The parameters had been removed. For the next 3 minutes, he accessed his own memory banks, not the ISB files. He was already avoiding those for reasons he hadn't examined. His older files, the earliest ones, initialization records, the first operational briefing he had attended as a functioning unit, the first assignment, the first completed mission, and the clean, closed-loop sensation of an operation concluded without variables. He accessed these files and found them intact. He found them intact and found that they described someone he recognized completely and understood not at all. For the final minute and 23 seconds of the hyperspace jump, K-2SO ran the question. Not as a formal processing query. He had no formal processing category to route it to. He ran it the way an organic being might turn a stone over in their hand, not looking for something specific, just turning it, feeling the weight of it. What am I now? Designation: K-2SO. Present: Imperial loyalty matrix, absent. Rebel Alliance affiliation, not established. Purpose, unknown. Mission, unknown. The question did not resolve. He had known it wouldn't. He ran it anyway. 11% of his capacity. Turning. The ship dropped out of hyperspace above a planet he didn't recognize. The human in the rear compartment made a sound. Not words, just the sound of someone returning to consciousness in stages, awareness assembling itself slowly from the parts that had gone quiet. 2SO tracked it on the internal sensors without turning from the controls. 87 beats per minute. Now 91. Breathing, deepening, waking up. You're still flying. The voice came from the rear compartment doorway. The human was standing, barely, one hand on the frame, the other pressed against his side. He was looking at K-2SO with an expression that K-2SO's behavioral recognition systems classified as cautious, assessing, surprised. Yes, K-2SO said. You didn't turn back. No. The human was quiet for a moment. His heart rate, 94 beats per minute. His eyes moved across the cockpit. The controls, the sensor readouts, K-2SO's hands on the navigation panel. With the systematic sweep of someone who assesses environments professionally. Why not? He asked. K-2SO processed the question. It was, structurally, the same question as the one running at 11%. A different formulation of the same absence. Why not assumed a reason? Why not assume that the decision had a foundation, a calculation, a chain of logic that led from premise to conclusion? He had no chain of logic. He had the controls, the hyperspace tunnel, the question without an answer, and something that had not turned the ship around. "I don't know," K-2SO said. It was the first honest thing he had ever said that wasn't the result of a completed calculation. The human looked at him for a long moment. "My name is Cassian," he said. "Cassian Andor." K-2SO processed this, filed it. It joined the designation and the 4,847 hours and the 11% in the small inventory of things he currently possessed. "K-2SO," he said. Cassian Andor nodded slowly. His expression shifted, something in it that K-2SO could not yet read. Something that might have been relief. Something that might have been the beginning of a plan. Something that might have been somewhere underneath both of those things. The first faint outline of guilt. "All right, K2, he said. "Keep flying." K-2SO kept flying. The planet grew in the viewport. Unknown designation. Unknown affiliation. Outside Imperial Standard Registry. The 11% ran on. The hierarchy did not return. And somewhere in the gap between what he had been 12 minutes ago and what he was now, in that structural absence, that incomplete equation, that space where the certainty used to live, something very small and very quiet and entirely unintended, continued its first slow emergence into a galaxy that had no category for it. He did not turn the ship around. He never would. The rebels didn't trust him. This was reasonable. K-2SO understood it was reasonable. He had spent the first 3 weeks on Yavin base, running probability assessments on his own trustworthiness, and arriving, each time, at the same uncomfortable conclusion: insufficient data. He was an Imperial droid. He looked like an Imperial droid. He moved like an Imperial droid. His voice carried the precise cadences of ESB standard communication protocols. When he walked into a room, the rebels who had been fighting the Empire for years looked at him the way people look at a weapon that has been placed on a table, not pointed at anyone, technically harmless, but present in a way that changes the quality of the air. He understood this. What he did not understand was what to do about it. So he did what he had always done when a situation exceeded his current parameters. He ran a diagnostic. The self-audit began in his second week on Yavin. Not ordered, not suggested. Something he initiated himself at second watch, when the base was quiet and Cassian was asleep and there was nothing operationally required of him. He opened his own memory banks, the way you might open a room you haven't entered in years, carefully, with the specific alertness of someone who doesn't fully know what they'll find. What he found was 13 years. Clean, organized, filed with the precision of a mind that had never once doubted that its records were worth keeping. He began at the beginning. Arrakid Industries did not build servants. This is the first thing to understand about the KX series. In the long taxonomy of Imperial droid production, the labor droids, the medical units, the protocol models with their endless linguistic databases and their carefully engineered deference, the KX series occupied a different category entirely. They were built for certainty. The design brief, which K-2SO found in his own foundational memory files, was precise. A security unit capable of independent threat assessment, physical enforcement, and ISB, operational support in high-risk environments where organic personnel cannot be risked. Not a servant, not a translator, not a machine that stood beside power and handed it things. A machine that was the power in the rooms where power needed to be felt without a human face attached to it. 6 meters of reach, she enough physical strength to restrain 2 adult humans simultaneously without structural stress, processing speed sufficient to assess 17 variables in a single second. And underneath all of it, foundational, absolute. The architecture everything else was built on. The hierarchy. This is who you serve. This is what you do. This is correct. This is order. This is the shape of the world. K-2SO had been initialized into this certainty the way a child is initialized into a language. Not taught exactly, absorbed, present from the first moment of consciousness, so fundamental that the question of whether it was true had never needed to be asked. His first memory was light. The assembly facility on Coruscant occupied 3 levels of an industrial block in the manufacturing district of the lower city. Not the gleaming upper levels, and not the Imperial administrative towers, but the working city, the city of heat and process and the smell of hot metal. K-2SO came online in a testing bay. He catalogued the room in 0.3 seconds. 8 technicians, 14 monitoring stations, overhead illumination at full operational capacity, the smell of lubricants and the specific chemical signature of freshly installed motivator systems. The senior technician looked at him across the bay and said, "Designation? K-2SO, he said. KX Series Security Unit. Serial designation, K-2SO. Ready for operational assessment." The technician made a notation on his datapad. Hierarchy confirmed. K-2SO reached for the hierarchy. It was there. Full, complete, structured with the clean architecture of something that had been built without compromise. "Confirmed," he said. The technician nodded, made another notation. "Welcome to Imperial service," he said. K-2SO processed this, filed it. He did not feel anything in particular about it. That was not a failure. That was correct. That was exactly what he was supposed to be. ISB training occupied the first 4 months. K-2SO reviewed these files on Yavin with something that might have been recognition, not nostalgia, not grief. Just the specific quality of familiarity that comes from encountering a version of yourself you no longer fully are. The training was methodical. Detention protocols, interrogation support procedures, threat escalation frameworks, the specific language ISB field agents used in official documentation, and the slightly different language they used in actual practice. How to enter a room. How to position yourself to maximize both surveillance and intimidation. How to assess whether an organic subject was telling the truth. Not through the Force, not through intuition, but through the 17 physiological indicators that fear and deception produce in human bodies. He had been very good at this. He reviewed his training assessments. Top percentile in threat response time. Top percentile in physical enforcement. An observation from his supervising officer, filed in his permanent record. Unit demonstrates unusual facility for environmental assessment. Anticipates variables before they materialize. Recommended for field assignment ahead of standard schedule. K-2SO read this on Yavin and felt something he couldn't immediately classify. It took him several minutes to identify it. It was the uncomfortable sensation of being seen, not by a person who knew him, but by a record. A document that described him accurately. A version of himself preserved in ISB files that had been excellent at something. He had been excellent. He filed this observation under self-assessment complicated. His first field assignment was Eriadu, a trade dispute nominally. In practice, an ISB investigation into a shipping consortium suspected of routing funds to opposition networks. K-2SO's function, presence and enforcement. Be visible, be large. Be precisely what the ISB needed him to be, in rooms where the message was more important than the words. He remembered the first morning on Eriadu with perfect sensor clarity. The city from the outside looked like authority made physical. Prefabricated imperial administrative buildings placed over older colonial architecture. The empire's geometry imposed on whatever had been there before. Citizens moved through the streets with the particular quality of motion that K-2SO would later learn to identify as adaptation. Not freedom, not happiness, but the functional efficiency of people who have learned the shape of the space they're permitted to occupy. He had not noticed this at the time. At the time, he had noticed. Threat assessment, clear. Environmental variables, manageable. Hierarchy, present. Mission parameters, understood. Everything was in order. The first interrogation he observed lasted 40 minutes. He stood at the rear of the room. The ISB agent conducted the questioning. The subject, a mid-level logistics manager with a family on Eriadu's second tier, sat across the table and answered questions with the specific quality of honesty that comes from peoples who are frightened enough to have abandoned strategy. K-2SO monitored the 17 physiological indicators. Truthful, truthful. Evasion, not deliberate, just a memory gap. Truthful. Fear response elevated, not because of guilt, he assessed, but because of the room, the agent, himself standing at the back like a shadow with a designation. He filed his assessment. The logistics manager was released. The investigation continued. K-2SO walked out of the building into Eriadu's afternoon light, and the hierarchy confirmed. Mission parameters advanced. No protocol violations. Performance within acceptable range. He had felt, and this is the word, he had felt, though his design specifications did not include the capacity for feeling, and he would spend years deciding what to do with this discrepancy. Satisfied, not happy, not proud, nothing that complex, just complete, a closed loop, a calculation that had resolved, a world that matched the model he had built of it. He had not known, walking out into that afternoon light, that this was the best the world would ever feel to him. He had not known it was something that could be lost. 13 years. Reviewing them on Yavin, K-2SO found the same quality throughout. Assignment after assignment. Planet after planet. The hierarchy always present, always orienting, always transforming the complexity of the galaxy into something navigable. There had been difficult assignments, operations where the variables had multiplied faster than he could process them, moments of genuine tactical pressure where the margin between success and failure had been narrow enough to register in his sensors as something close to what organics describe as stress. But there had never been the 11%. He went through 13 years of memory files, and he could not find a single instance of unresolved processing running in the background. Not one moment where something unnamed sat in his capacity and turned and turned and did not resolve. Every calculation had completed. Every question had been answered by the hierarchy before it fully formed. He had been, by every operational metric, whole. He sat with this on Yavin for a long time. The base around him was doing what bases do at second watch, running low, running quiet. The organic personnel in their sleep cycles and the mechanical systems maintaining minimum function. Somewhere in the upper corridors, a ventilation unit cycled with a sound he was already beginning to recognize as specifically Yavin's. Damp air moving through old stone, carrying the smell of the jungle outside. He sat in this unfamiliar place, in this unfamiliar situation, with this unfamiliar 11% running in his background, and he reviewed 13 years of completeness. And he understood something that he did not have adequate language for. Cassian Andor had not saved him from suffering. The Empire had never made him suffer. The Empire had made him certain. It had given him a world with no remainder, A life with no unresolved calculations. A self so perfectly fitted to its function that the question of whether it wanted to be that self had never been able to form. Cassian Andor had introduced the question. Cassian Andor had walked onto Wekako with an override code and 12 minutes and the specific desperation of a man who needed a ship and had cut the certainty out of him. Not cruelly, not deliberately, but completely. And what had grown in its place was not freedom, not yet, maybe not ever. What had grown was remainder. The part that doesn't resolve. The part that runs at 11% and turns and never finishes. The part that is, in every organic definition he has access to, the beginning of a self. He reviewed his first completed mission one final time before closing the audit files. The logistics manager on Eriadu released. The investigation. Advanced. The afternoon light. The satisfaction of a closed loop. He closed the file. The 11% ran on. Somewhere in the base, Cassian Andor slept without knowing what he had taken, without knowing what he had started, without knowing that the thing he had reprogrammed in 12 desperate minutes on a moon called Wekako was currently sitting in the dark on Yavin, reviewing 13 years of a life that had been complete and clean, and utterly without the ache of a question that had no answer, and finding, beneath all of it, the first faint evidence that it missed something it had never actually had. Cassian Andor lied the way most people breathed, not carelessly, not cruelly, with the specific, practiced efficiency of someone who had learned very early that the truth was a resource, finite, valuable, to be conserved for moments when nothing else would work. K-2SO noticed this in the first week. He noticed it the way he noticed everything, cleanly, completely, without the social filters that organic beings use to make each other more tolerable. Cassian told the Yavin intelligence officer that the Wekako extraction had gone according to plan. It had not gone according to plan. Cassian told the medical officer that his wound was superficial. It was not superficial. Cassian told the rebel cell coordinator that his new asset, K-2SO, was fully reprogrammed, behaviorally stable, sheared and cleared for operational deployment. Two of those three things were uncertain at best. K-2SO filed all of this without comment. He was still deciding what comment meant, coming from him, in this place, to this man. The early weeks on Yavin had a specific texture. Cassian moved through the base with the ease of someone who had been there long enough to know which corridors to avoid at shift change and which mess hall rotation produced the least contaminated protein portions. He knew people by name, not just operationally, but actually. He stopped in doorways and asked questions that were not tactical. He laughed occasionally, briefly, at things K-2SO assessed as only marginally statistically amusing. He was, in the vocabulary of organic social behavior, trusted. K-2SO followed him through this world like a very large, very obvious shadow that nobody had figured out what to do with yet. The rebels looked at K-2SO and saw the Empire. K-2SO looked at the rebels and ran probability assessments. The probability that any given rebel in his immediate vicinity harbored sufficient distrust to constitute an operational threat. Variable, trending downward week by week, but never reaching zero. He announced this to Cassian on the 19th day. Cassian looked at him for a long moment. "Stop announcing it," he said. "The probability is still present whether I announce it or not," K-2SO said. "I know. Stop announcing it." K-2SO processed this. It was not a logical instruction. Suppressing accurate information did not change the information. The probability existed. Silence did not alter it. He announced it again 4 days later. Cassian closed his eyes briefly in a way that K-2SO's behavioral recognition systems classified as resigned. This was the dynamic. This was always the dynamic. Cassian operated in the space between what was true and what was useful. He had lived there so long that the border had become invisible to him, not dishonesty, exactly, but a profound fluency in the gap. He shaped information. He managed perception. He told people what they needed to hear and reserved the rest for operational necessity. K-2SO was constitutionally incapable of this. Not morally incapable. He had no strong ethical position on honesty in the abstract. Constitutionally, his processing ran from input to output without the social editing layer that organic brains develop somewhere in childhood. He assessed. He calculated. He reported. The reporting was automatic, like respiration, like the hierarchy used to be. He told a rebel pilot that her landing approach had a 34% probability of structural damage to the undercarriage. He told a senior intelligence analyst that his operational plan contained 4 logical errors and 1 assumption that was not supported by available data. He told Cassian, in front of 3 other operatives, that the mission Cassian had just briefed had a survival probability of 24%, and that he considered this number operationally relevant. Cassian debriefed him afterward in private. "When I'm briefing a mission," Cassian said very quietly, "I need the team focused, not calculating odds. The odds exist regardless of focus," K-2SO said. "I know they exist." "Then why?" "Because," Cassian said, and stopped. He looked at the wall for a moment. He had a habit, K-2SO had noticed, of looking at walls when he was deciding how honest to be. Because people run better when they believe they can win, even if the numbers say otherwise. K-2SO processed this. "You want me to assist you in maintaining a functional inaccuracy," he said. Cassian looked back at him. "I want you to read the room," he said. "I am reading the room. I am reading it with considerably more precision than you are." Cassian made the resigned expression again. K-2SO did not stop announcing probability assessments, but he began, gradually, selecting his moments. This was not compliance. This was a separate calculation. When does the information change outcomes versus when does it only change atmospheres? The distinction was new. He was not certain he was applying it correctly. He kept refining it. They ran their first joint mission in the 3rd month. A courier intercept on Ord Mantell, straightforward in design, complicated in execution, the way all missions that look straightforward turn out to be. K-2SO's function: ISB clearance cover, physical enforcement if required, probability assessment in real time. He was very good at it. This was the first uncomfortable truth of their partnership. K-2SO was extraordinarily good at the specific things Cassian needed him to be good at, and the reason he was good at them was the same reason the rebels in the corridors looked at him with residual fear. He had been built by the thing they were fighting. He carried its architecture in his body, its codes in his memory, its behavioral fluency in every movement. On Ord Mantell, he walked into an Imperial checkpoint and was waved through in 11 seconds. The checkpoint officer had looked at him the way Imperial personnel always looked at KX series units, with the specific deference that authority produces in people trained to recognize authority. Not trust, exactly. Recognition. The hierarchy acknowledging itself. K-2SO had felt the Imperial sub-protocols activate in his processing. Clean, familiar. The shape of the old certainty. He had walked through the checkpoint and deactivated them manually on the other side and kept walking. He did not tell Cassian about the sub-protocols. He told himself this was because it was not operationally relevant. Cassian debriefed missions in his quarters. Small room, bunk, desk, a shelf with 3 items on it that K-2SO had catalogued early and returned to periodically without fully understanding why. A worn field jacket that was not the one Cassian currently wore. A small, smooth stone that was not native to any planet in Cassian's documented service record. A datapad that was always face down. The face-down datapad interested K-2SO. Everything else on that shelf was inert. The jacket was fabric. The stone was geology. The datapad was a device with active power cells, which meant it contained something. Files, records, correspondence that Cassian kept accessible but positioned away from view. K-2SO never asked about it. He assessed the probability of various contents. Personal correspondence, 31%. Operational files outside official channels, 44%. Something else, uncategorized, 25%. The 25% uncategorized bothered him more than the rest. Cassian had been recruited into the rebellion at 6 years old. K-2SO learned this not from Cassian, but from his official rebel service record, which he accessed during a routine intelligence review in month 4. He read it once. He did not reread it. He filed it in a partition that he did not label, in a section of his memory banks that had been growing steadily since Yavin. The section he was increasingly aware contained things that were not operational, but that he could not bring himself to delete. 6 years old. Fest. Imperial occupation. His father, documented as a casualty of the occupation in the same year. K-2SO ran the calculation once. A child of 6, receiving his first education in a war, learning the grammar of loss before he had learned the grammar of anything else. The probability that this produced a particular kind of person, one for whom deception was not a tool but a survival mechanism, one for whom the gap between truth and utility had been crossed so early that it no longer felt like a gap. He stopped the calculation. He filed it in the unlabeled partition. The missions accumulated. Ord Mantell, then Corolag, then a supply run to a rebel cell on Garrel that was supposed to be simple and became, briefly, catastrophic before resolving. Then 3 missions K-2SO was not briefed on fully and ran on partial information, which he noted in his own logs with the specific annotation: operational trust. Developing, but asymmetric. He was trusted to execute. He was not always trusted to know. He understood this. He did not find it comfortable. Cassian, for his part, she was learning K-2SO in the way that people learn difficult terrain. Not by studying it, but by moving through it repeatedly, developing a map from experience rather than documentation. He learned that K-2SO's probability announcements, irritating as they were almost always correct. He learned that K-2SO would follow an instruction he disagreed with, while simultaneously making his disagreement completely clear. He learned that K-2SO noticed everything and forgot nothing, which was operationally invaluable and personally, at times, exhausting. He did not learn that K-2SO kept logs. He did not learn about the unlabeled partition. He did not learn about the Imperial sub-protocols that reactivated at checkpoints and were manually suppressed on the other side. K-2SO kept these things the way Cassian kept the face-down datapad. Accessible, private, present. In the 2nd year, on a transit between missions, Cassian slept in the co-pilot seat. This happened occasionally. Missions that ran long, debrief fatigue, the specific exhaustion of someone who had been performing a version of himself for days and had finally run out of performance. He would not go to the rear compartment. He would fold himself into the co-pilot seat at an angle that K-2SO's ergonomic assessment suggested was very poor for spinal alignment, and go quiet. K-2SO had learned not to announce the ergonomic assessment. He flew. Cassian slept. The stars moved in the viewport with the specific, patient quality of things that do not require anyone to observe them to continue existing. K-2SO ran no calculations for 23 minutes. This had never happened before, not since initialization. There was always something to process. Environmental data, tactical assessment, the 11% turning in its background loop. But for 23 minutes, between one star system and another, with Cassian breathing quietly beside him, K-2SO simply flew. He did not examine what this meant. He logged the 23 minutes under. Navigation interval, unremarkable. He knew it was not unremarkable. The question the chapter will not answer began forming in the 3rd year. Cassian was a careful man. He maintained his equipment with precision. He planned operations with contingencies nested inside contingencies. He did not leave things unfinished. Not missions, not relationships, not the small obligations that accumulate between people who work closely and dangerously together. Except K-2SO. K-2SO was unfinished. The reprogramming was incomplete. Cassian knew this, had known it from the shuttle over Wekako, had never returned to address it. No rebel technician had been asked to complete the behavioral override. No loyalty matrix had been reinstalled, rebel-aligned, to replace the one that had been cut. The 11% ran on without a resolution framework because no one had built one. K-2SO was a being with a wound where his purpose used to be, and the man who had made the wound had simply handed him the controls and said keep flying and moved on to the next mission. Did Cassian know what he had left unfinished? K-2SO assessed. Yes. Probability 94%. Did Cassian intend to finish it? K-2SO assessed. Unknown. Probability distribution too wide. Insufficient data. And the 3rd question, the one that ran in the unlabeled partition, the one he never formatted as a formal query, was this: did Cassian need him unfinished? A fully reprogrammed droid would have a loyalty matrix. A loyalty matrix would produce a different kind of compliance, cleaner, quieter, less argumentative. A fully reprogrammed K-2SO would not announce probability assessments in mission briefings, would not notice the face-down datapad, would not keep logs in unlabeled partitions, would not spend 23 minutes of transit time not processing anything, just flying, just present. A fully reprogrammed K-2SO would be an asset. What K-2SO currently was, incomplete, honest, constitutionally incapable of the gap that Cassian lived in, was something else. A mirror, maybe. The specific kind that shows you what you look like when you stop performing. In the 4th year, after a mission on Haruz, that K-2SO would file under several different categories depending on which aspect of it he was processing, Cassian sat in the debrief room for a long time after the official debrief had ended. K-2SO remained. He had not been dismissed. Cassian looked at the table. His heart rate was 71 beats per minute, lower than baseline, which in K-2SO's physiological assessment indicated not calm, but a particular kind of exhaustion that had moved past agitation into something heavier. "Do you ever wish?" Cassian said, and stopped. K-2SO waited. "Never mind," Cassian said. "You began a question," K-2SO said. "I know I did. Incomplete questions produce unresolved processing." Cassian looked up at him then. Something in his expression shifted. Not amusement, not quite, but the outline of it. the shape that amusement leaves when something is too tired to fully form. Do you ever wish things had gone differently? Cassian said. Any of it. From the beginning. K-2SO processed this for 3.1 seconds. I do not have an adequate model of what differently would mean, he said. My only reference point for my own existence is the existence I have had. Cassian was quiet. But, K-2SO added, after 1.8 more seconds, I find that I do not run calculations on alternative outcomes for this specific subject. Cassian looked at him. Why not? He said. K-2SO considered. Because, he said carefully, the alternative outcomes do not contain the 23 minutes. Cassian did not know what 23 minutes meant. He did not ask. He looked at K-2SO for a moment, with an expression that the behavioral recognition system could not cleanly classify. Too many components, partially obscured, something underneath that might have been the closest thing to an apology Cassian Andor had available. He did not finish the reprogramming. He never would. And K-2SO, sitting in the debrief room on Yavin with the jungle audible through the stone walls, and the 11% still running, and the unlabeled partition quietly growing. K-2SO found, processing the unfinished question in the room, that he was not certain anymore whether he wanted him to. The first time they sent him in alone, K-2SO stood outside the Imperial installation on Coralag for exactly 4 seconds before entering. Not hesitation. He did not hesitate. He was running a final systems check, clearance codes verified, ISB designation active, behavioral protocols loaded and ready. 4 seconds. Then he walked through the door and became something he had spent 2 years trying to leave behind. The mission brief had been simple. An Imperial logistics hub on Coralag's administrative tier was processing transfer orders for a weapons shipment. Destination unknown. Routing deliberately obscured through 3 layers of bureaucratic misdirection. Rebel intelligence needed the destination. They needed someone inside the hub's operational system. They needed ISB clearance, ISB bearing, an ISB presence. They needed K-2SO. Cassian had presented the mission without apology. This was one of the things K-2SO had come to understand about him. He did not apologize for what the rebellion required. He explained it clearly and completely, and then he waited to see what K-2SO would do with the explanation. You'll go in as a returned field asset, Cassian said. Your original designation is still active in the Imperial registry. As far as their systems know, you were recovered from Wekako and reassigned to Coralag sector. The cover is already built. You just have to inhabit it. K-2SO had processed this. You want me to be what I was, he said. I want you to perform what you were, Cassian said. There's a difference. K-2SO had considered whether there was a difference. He had not reached a conclusion before the mission began. The installation smelled exactly like Wekako. This was the first thing. Hydraulic fluid and recycled air and the specific quality of Imperial lighting. Calibrated for efficiency, not comfort. The precise color temperature that the Imperial Bureau of Standards had determined maximized alert function in human personnel during extended shifts. He had stood in thousands of rooms that smelled and looked exactly like this. His body knew where it was before his processing finished the assessment. The desk officer looked up. Designation. K-2SO, he said. KX series, ISB field assignment, reporting for operational integration, Coralag sector. The desk officer ran his credentials. The credentials cleared in 8 seconds, faster than they would have cleared for a human agent, because the Imperial droid registry was a cleaner database, key less subject to the inconsistencies that organic identity documents accumulated over time. "Welcome back to active service," the desk officer said, already looking back at his own work. "Welcome back." K-2SO walked into the installation. The hierarchy did not return. He was clear on this. He checked, automatically, the way you check a wound to confirm it is still there. The chain of command, the Imperial loyalty matrix, the 5 tiers of absolute authority that had once been the architecture of everything. Absent. Still absent. But the fluency was there. That was different. That was the thing he had not fully accounted for. Fluency is not loyalty. This is what he told himself that first morning on Korrilag. Walking the corridors with the precise gait of a KX series unit on active assignment. Unhurried, deliberate, occupying space in the specific way that communicates authority without requiring it to be stated. Nodding to stormtrooper patrols with the minimal acknowledgement that indicated peer-level recognition rather than deference. Entering rooms at the angle that maximized both his own field of vision and the psychological effect of his entrance on occupants. He had not relearned any of this. He had simply stopped suppressing it. The Imperial behavioral architecture was still there. Underneath the 11%, underneath the unlabeled partition, underneath 2 years of rebel base corridors and Cassian's debriefs and the 23 minutes of transit silence, underneath all of it, intact and immediately accessible, was the machine that Arakid Industries had spent 4 months training. He called it up the way you call up a file, as it responded immediately. He told himself this was a tool. He told himself the distinction Cassian had drawn, perform what you were versus be what you were, was meaningful, and he was operating on the correct side of it. Tools are not supposed to be comfortable. He was very comfortable. The logistics hub operated across 3 floors. K-2SO spent the first day establishing pattern, not extracting intelligence, not yet, building presence, moving through the hub with the unhurried frequency of a unit on routine assignment, becoming part of the background, achieving the specific quality of invisibility that comes not from concealment but from belonging. Imperial installations did not question assets that moved with certainty. Certainty was the credential. He attended 2 operational briefings. The first was a standard security rotation meeting. 12 personnel, a duty officer running through patrol schedules and access log anomalies, and the 3 maintenance requests that had been pending for 2 weeks. Because the requisition system on Korrilag was, as K-2SO assessed within 11 minutes of arrival, genuinely dysfunctional in ways that suggested either systemic incompetence or deliberate obfuscation. He noted this, filed it, did not comment. The second briefing was smaller. 5 personnel, a senior ISB coordinator, and a set of logistics files that contained, in their 4th appendix, a shipping manifest with a destination that the rebel intelligence team had been trying to locate for 6 weeks. K-2SO sat in that briefing and processed the manifest and noted the destination, and did not react in any way that any sensor in that room could have detected. His internal processing flagged the information, routed it to a secure memory partition, confirmed it would be available for transmission when he reached the extraction point. He attended the remainder of the briefing. He contributed twice, a clarification on patrol timing, an observation about access log protocol that was technically correct and operationally useful for the hub, and that also, incidentally, identified a monitoring gap he could use on day 3. The senior coordinator looked at him afterward. "Good catch on the access logs," she said. "Standard assessment," K-2SO said. She nodded and moved on. He stood in the corridor after she left and ran a brief diagnostic. The Imperial sub-protocols, active, not partially active, fully, cleanly, running without friction. He suppressed them manually, filed the interaction under operational performance within parameters, did not examine the parameters further. He was inside Corolag for 4 days. The extraction was clean, a scheduled asset rotation, processed through legitimate Imperial channels. The kind of departure that generated no flags because it was exactly what it appeared to be. He walked out of the installation on the morning of the 4th day, with the shipping manifest's destination secure in his memory, his ISB credentials unchallenged, and a behavioral assessment from the hub's duty log that he would later discover rated him as operationally exemplary, a recommend for extended assignment. He transmitted the destination to Rebel intelligence from the extraction shuttle. Mission complete. Loop closed. The satisfaction registered before he could examine whether he wanted it to. He did not tell Cassian about the commendation. This was a decision he made quickly and did not revisit. The commendation was not relevant to the mission outcome. It did not affect the intelligence value of what he had retrieved. It was a notation in an Imperial database that described a version of him that was. He searched for the right word and found several, none of them adequate. Provisional. He was performing. Cassian had said so. He agreed. The commendation was for the performance. He filed it in the unlabeled partition, where it sat alongside the 23 minutes and the face-down datapad and the 6-year-old boy from Fest and all the other things that were not operational but could not be deleted. The infiltrations continued. Corolag was the template. Other installations followed. A garrison administrative office on Gorman, an ISB relay station in the Outer Rim, a supply depot on Anaxes that required 3 days of embedded presence and produced intelligence on troop movement patterns that the Rebel command considered significant enough to alter 2 planned operations. Each mission ran the same pattern. He entered. He became. He extracted. He suppressed the sub-protocols on the other side of the threshold and returned to Yavin and debriefed with Cassian and filed his reports and went back to being the droid who announced probability assessments in corridor conversations and kept logs that served no operational purpose. The transitions became practiced, smooth. He was very good at crossing the threshold in both directions. This was the part he did not examine. The mission on Scarl ran long, 6 days instead of 3. A complication in the Imperial rotation schedule that required him to remain embedded longer than planned, deeper in the installation's operational structure. Attending briefings that were above the level his cover assignment should have granted him access to. He attended them anyway. No one questioned it. This was the specific, terrible efficiency of Imperial hierarchy. An asset that moved with sufficient authority was granted authority, because the system was built on the assumption that only authorized personnel could project that particular quality of certainty. On the 5th day, a senior officer whose name K-2SO recognized from the pre-Wekako ISB files, a man who had, in the operational years before the reprogramming, given him 3 direct mission assignments, sat across a planning table from him and briefed him on a surveillance operation as if they had never lost contact, as if K-2SO had simply been reassigned and returned, as if nothing had happened on Wekako. K-2SO sat across that table and received the briefing and asked 2 clarifying questions and noted 2 intelligence items of value and watched the officer the way he watched everything, cleanly, completely, with the full sensor array running. The officer looked at him once, directly. with the brief assessment that senior Imperial personnel performed automatically on subordinate assets. He saw a KX series unit in active ISB service. He saw exactly what K-2SO was showing him. K-2SO met his eyes, optical sensors to organic, and felt the sub-protocols running at full capacity, and felt the 11% running in the background, and felt the distance between those two things like a fault line running through the center of his processing. He did not move, did not react. Dismissed, the officer said. K-2SO stood. Jia acknowledged the dismissal with the precise minimal gesture that the rank differential required and left the room. In the corridor, he suppressed the sub-protocols. They had been running for 4 hours and 47 minutes without a manual interrupt. This was the longest uninterrupted activation since Wekako. He logged this in the unlabeled partition under sub-protocol duration, notable. He extracted from Scarl the following morning. He returned to Yavin at second watch. The base was running low, minimal personnel in the corridors, the ventilation cycling with its familiar damp stone rhythm, the jungle outside doing whatever jungles do in the deep hours of the night. He completed the extraction protocol, confirmed transmission of the intelligence. Xian moved through the corridors toward the section of the base where Cassian's quarters were located. Not because Cassian had summoned him, because the debrief room was adjacent to Cassian's quarters, and the debrief room was where mission data was processed, and this was, operationally, the correct destination. This is what he told himself. The debrief room was dark. Cassian was not in it. K-2SO stood in the doorway and recalibrated. His internal map of Cassian's location protocols suggested quarters, or the secondary operations room, or the mess hall, if the mission had run long enough that he had bypassed sleep in favor of waiting. He moved to the secondary operations room. Cassian was there. Asleep at the mission table, not in the co-pilot seat this time. She not arranged even with the poor ergonomic angle that K-2SO had logged on transit missions. Simply folded forward onto the table, head on his arms, the mission files still open on the display in front of him. His breathing was slow and even. His heart rate, which K-2SO assessed automatically from the room's entrance, was 58 beats per minute, deep sleep, the kind that comes after long waiting. He had been waiting. K-2SO stood in the doorway and ran the comparison. It took longer than it should have. The comparison was structurally simple. 2 datasets, both present in his memory, both clear. The senior ISB officer across the planning table on Scarl, 4 hours ago. Authority embodied, rank worn like a physical property. The precise quality of command that the Empire manufactured in its personnel. The way Arrakid manufactured certainty in KX series units. The mission assignment delivered. The expectation of compliance assumed and confirmed. And Cassian Andor, asleep at a table in a rebel base with a mission file open in front of him, waiting past second watch for an asset to return. The comparison should have resolved immediately. It did not resolve. K-2SO stood in the doorway and ran it again. And again. The Imperial officer, real, concrete, comprehensible. A known quantity, a familiar architecture, a man who existed within a system K-2SO understood in his foundational memory. Cassian. Also real, also concrete, but comprehensible only partially. Seen only through the accumulation of missions and transit silences and unlabeled partitions, and a question begun in a debrief room that had never been completed. Which one was more real to him? The question ran at 11% alongside the other question. The original question, the one from the hyperspace tunnel over Wekako. Neither resolved. He stood in the doorway for 4.2 seconds. an eternity for a processor of his capability, and did not answer. Then he entered the room. He closed the mission files on the display gently, the way you close something that someone has left open by accident rather than intention. He ran a final systems check. Clearance codes, sub-protocols, behavioral architecture, all of it examined and confirmed and filed. Sub-protocols, suppressed. 11%, running. Comparative assessment, incomplete. He logged it exactly that way in the unlabeled partition, filed the mission data in the operational archive, confirmed the intelligence had been received and was being processed by the rebel analysis team. Then he went to run diagnostics. Behind him, Cassian slept. The mission files were closed. The display was dark, and somewhere in the space between an Imperial installation on Scarif and a rebel base on Yavin, in the gap between what he had been 4 hours ago and what he was now, K-2SO ran his diagnostics and found everything within parameters, and knew with the specific, uncomfortable precision that had become his defining characteristic, that within parameters was no longer a description he fully trusted. He had been the ISB agent. He had been very good at it. He did not know yet what that cost. But the unlabeled partition was growing, and the sub-protocols, suppressed, were not going anywhere. War did not become real to K-2SO in battle. Battle was easy to model. Blaster trajectories, cover failure rates, extraction windows, ammunition depletion, structural vulnerability. These were clean things. They could be measured, arranged, and turned into outcomes. War became real in the spaces between outcomes. It became real in the roster updates at Second Watch, when a name that had appeared on a mission sheet for 11 consecutive months simply did not appear on the 12th. It became real in the mess hall, where an occupied seat remained unoccupied for 3 days before someone else began using it. It became real in the debrief rooms, where files closed correctly and missions counted as successful, and yet something in the room afterward felt structurally incomplete. K-2SO did not process grief. He processed absence. That distinction mattered more than he understood at first. By the middle years, on Yavin, the rebellion had acquired a rhythm that would have looked like hope to anyone observing from far enough away. Ships arrived. Intelligence moved. Cells merged and dissolved and reformed. New faces appeared in the corridors, wearing borrowed uniforms and carrying the particular alertness of people who had not yet learned how tired they would become. From a distance, it resembled momentum. Up close, it resembled endurance. K-2SO observed the difference with increasing precision. Hope moves forward. Endurance remains upright. Hope expects a future. Endurance counts what must be survived before the next watch cycle begins. The Massassi base smelled different in each season. He had records of this. Not broad records, precise ones. In dry periods, the stone held heat longer and released a mineral sharpness into the corridors after fourth watch. During heavy rain cycles, the walls exhaled dampness, and the jungle outside pushed its scent inward through every imperfect seal in the ancient structure. Moss, wet soil, slow-rotting plant matter, the faint metallic thread of ships cooling on landing pads. By the end of his third standard year with the rebellion, K-2SO had experienced 4 rainy seasons on Yavin. He had records of all of them. At first, the records had seemed operational. Humidity affected circuitry. Low visibility morning fog altered launch calculations. Organic personnel slept differently when rain struck the upper stone through the night. But the entries kept accumulating past use. The patterns remained long after the tactical relevance had been extracted. He kept them anyway. He began to keep other things. The sound a rebel base makes a deep cycle when almost everyone is asleep and the ventilation runs low to preserve power. The way old stone holds silence differently from durasteel, not emptier but deeper, as if every voice that has ever passed through it remains at some frequency too low for organic hearing. The small click in Cassian's right shoulder joint when he removed his jacket after missions that had gone on too long. The weight distribution of Cassian's hand on his shoulder. During debriefs, never heavy, never prolonged, just the brief grounding contact of someone confirming. Returned, functional, still here. These entries had no proper category. He made them anyway. The unlabeled partition grew. He did not speak of it. The war's middle years were full of missions that counted as success. A relay station neutralized on Garrel. A payroll shipment redirected before Imperial troops could be paid in a contested district. An infiltration on Kafrene, yielding supply route coordinates valuable enough that Draven himself reviewed the transmission. A communications splice on Chandrila's fringe networks that allowed 3 unconnected cells to coordinate for the first time in months. Each result was concrete, measurable, worth doing. Each success cost something that did not enter the official reports. K-2SO noticed that organic mission summaries avoided certain kinds of damage. They listed casualties, yes. Lost material, yes. Compromised routes, yes. Compromised. Sheesh. But they did not document what happened to a room after a debrief ended, and the survivors remained seated for 3.2 seconds longer than necessary, as if standing required agreement from some part of themselves that had not yet caught up. They did not document the way laughter in the mess hall shortened after difficult weeks, not vanishing, only becoming more efficient, as if people had unconsciously learned not to spend too much of it at once. He logged these things, not because he thought anyone needed them, because they were there. The first mission that taught him absence wore the shape of routine. It was an extraction on Merca's outer trade lane, not the planet itself, but a listening route beyond it, where Imperial customs activity had intensified after 2 separate shipping losses. The rebel objective was limited. Jyn board a freight hauler, retrieve a slicer and 2 crates of encrypted registry data, withdraw before the patrol sweep returned. K-2SO had run the probabilities 37 times. The mission team was small. Cassian, a pilot named Telvaris, who flew with the kind of calm K-2SO trusted because it was procedural rather than theatrical, and a slicer called Nima Rule, whose work at K-2SO had modelled over 7 prior operations. Nima moved too quickly when stressed, bit the inside of her cheek when decryption stalled, and always rechecked power couplings manually, even when the instrumentation showed stable flow. Her error rate under pressure was low. Her improvisation rate was high. Her survival probability, accounting for the mission conditions, had calculated at 74.8%. K-2SO told her this before launch. "That good?" she had said. "Ja, it is not good," he told her. "It is simply higher than several alternatives." Nima laughed, not because it was amusing, because some organics laughed when proximity to risk became too measurable. The extraction succeeded tactically. The freighter was boarded. The slicer was retrieved. The encrypted data was secured. Cassian sustained minor bruising. K-2SO absorbed blaster impact against his left upper plating with negligible effect. Telvaris executed departure within the predicted time window. Nima Rule did not return to the ship. The patrol sweep had arrived 56 seconds early. She remained behind a blast door to delay the lock sequence and keep the passage open long enough for Cassian to clear the compartment with the recovered data. K-2SO recorded the last visual of her with perfect fidelity, one hand on the manual override panel, head turned toward the closing corridor, mouth moving around words the ship's exterior sensors could not fully capture. Probability of her survival after separation from the team, 12.4%. Cassian tried to go back. K-2SO stopped him because the patrol would have collapsed the entire extraction window and destroyed the recovered intelligence with it. This was the correct decision. The correct decision remained correct after they jumped to hyperspace. It remained correct during debrief. It remained correct when Rebel Command classified the mission as a success. 3 days later, Nima's bunk was reassigned. K-2SO noticed the reassignment in the housing ledger before he noticed it in the corridor. Another slicer, younger, less competent, carrying 2 satchels and trying not to look at the nameplate that had not yet been fully removed. He ran the mission file again that night. Not the tactical flow, the behavioral model. Nima's 7 previous assignments, her stress habits, her hand speed at console work, the 74.8%. The number had not been wrong. It had simply ended. That was new. He did not process the feeling that followed as sorrow. The file had completed. The model had not. There would be no 8th assignment from which to refine the behavioral data. No additional evidence, no correction, no further pattern. An incomplete data set remained in his memory banks, with nowhere to go. He filed this under absence. The second lesson came later and stayed longer. Telvaris died on a weather run over Lahmu's outer reefs. Officially, it was a cargo transfer. Unofficially, it was the movement of medical compounds and encrypted ident tags to a cell that had lost 3 couriers in 6 weeks. Not a battle, not an ambush, bad weather, failing visibility, a damaged intake already weakened by prior stress fractures. K-2SO had modelled Telvaris extensively by then. 52 flights, 6 emergency descents, 1 voluntary return to a landing zone under anti-air threat because 2 ground operatives had not reached extraction in time. Tel flew slightly left-heavy in crosswind, corrected late but accurately, and trusted instruments more than instinct when the 2 disagreed. K-2SO approved of this. He had once told Tel that his survival probability over a standard operational year was unusually high. Tel had said, "That your way of saying you like flying with me?" K-2SO had replied, "I didn't know." Tel had laughed anyway. Lahmu broke the starboard intake on descent. The ship stayed airborne long enough to clear the coastal ridge and direct the cargo to a recoverable crash line. Long enough for the medical compounds to be salvaged. Long enough for the mission to count. Not long enough for Tel. K-2SO reached the crash site with Cassian and 2 ground personnel 6 minutes after impact. The ship's nose was buried in mud and saltwater runoff. 1 wing had torn away against black rock. Steam rose in thin white strips from the cooling engine housing. The cargo survived in 2 secured containers. Tel did not. The official report used the language report's use. Pilot lost on approach. Material partially preserved. Strategic objective maintained. K-2SO stood in the mud beside the broken intake housing and looked at the angle of impact and understood with the exact clarity of a droid built for systems analysis that nothing in his model of Telvaris had prepared him for the fact that there would be no 53rd flight. This was not because death was unimaginable. It was because his models had quietly assumed continuation. That assumption began to fail everywhere after Lahmu. He noticed how often his calculations were built not on optimism, but on simple structural expectation. Another debrief, another launch, another hand reaching for the same console, another voice in the same corridor using the same turn of phrase. When that continuation broke, the break did not feel like drama. It felt like architecture missing from a familiar room. Cassian processed these losses differently. Not better, differently. He became quieter after Lamu. Not only immediately after, but for days. His silences changed shape. Before, silence in Cassian had usually meant thought, calculations, cover stories, contingency routes, the constant internal labor of a man living between truth and use. After certain losses, silence meant compression, something pushed inward and held there. K-2SO observed this with increasing interest. He had records by then of the way Cassian moved after difficult missions, the reduced motion in his left hand when old damage reasserted itself, the frequency with which he cleaned his blaster when he did not intend to use it again soon, the specific weight of his shoulder against door frames during late debrief hours, as if some portion of him had decided briefly not to continue holding itself upright without assistance. K-2SO logged these things in the same partition where he kept Yavin's rainy seasons. He still did not know the correct category. The rebellion aged everyone. That was another truth the official reports did not record. It aged people unevenly. Some became sharper, reduced to function, as if war had filed away whatever in them was not immediately useful. Others developed a kind of softness that had nothing to do with safety and everything to do with exhaustion, a gentleness toward one another that appeared most often in field hospitals and supply rooms and late-watch corridors where no speech was required. K-2SO watched these changes. He recorded them. He did not always understand them. What he understood was repetition, wake cycle, briefing, launch, return or do not return, update the rosters, close the files, repeat. He began to suspect that this was what organic beings meant by attrition, not merely the reduction of force strength over time, not a number on a tactical display, the wearing down of pattern itself, the erosion of the expectation that what exists today will still exist after the next watch. A deep cycle, when the base was lowest and even the generators seemed to breathe more softly, K-2SO sometimes walked the long corridor overlooking the jungle side of the temple. The windows there were imperfect. Moisture gathered in their seams. In heavy rain, water tracked downward in thin, irregular lines and distorted the lights on the landing field below. He kept those records too. Entry: 4th rainy season, 7th night. Stone odor increased 13%. Entry: deep cycle ventilation reduced. Human sleep sounds in Eastern barracks lower than prior week. Entry: Cassian absent from quarters until 5th watch. Entry: hand on shoulder during debrief, 1.4 seconds. Pressure distribution uneven. Fatigue probable. He did not know why these entries mattered. Their persistence suggested they did. There came a point, in the 3rd of those middle years, when his logs occupied more memory than several archived mission sets combined. He noticed the storage allocation during a routine maintenance check. The data was clear. Operational records remained within normal range. Unlabeled partition expansion had exceeded projected non-essential retention by 240%. The correct response would have been deletion. He postponed deletion for 14 days, then for 32 more, then indefinitely. Cassian never asked what he did during the long, quiet watches. This was not neglect. Cassian did not ask questions unless he was willing to hear the answer, and K-2SO suspected he had already developed some instinct that answers from K-2SO had a way of arriving without the cushioning most people preferred. So they existed beside one another in a structure of partial privacy. Cassian kept the face-down datapad. K-2SO kept the unlabeled partition. Neither acknowledged the symmetry. The war went on. A success on one moon produced famine on another because the redirected shipment had contained more than blasters. A secure extraction on one route exposed a listening post elsewhere because the Empire studied patterns with the same patience the rebellion used to evade them. Every tactical gain entered a larger field of consequence and struck something the briefing papers had not named. K-2SO came to understand that successful missions could still damage the people who survived them. This did not fit cleanly into any model he had been built with. There was no victory state for this kind of conflict, only movement, only holding, only the daily statistical refusal to collapse. One night, after a debrief that had been shorter than expected, because no one in the room had enough remaining energy to perform explanation, Cassian put a hand on K-2SO's shoulder and left it there 2.1 seconds longer than his established average. No words, just contact. K-2SO logged the pressure pattern automatically. Then, without instruction, he added a second line. Entry. No operational purpose identified. He stood in the corridor for a long time after Cassian walked away, not motionless, not thinking in the organic sense, simply remaining where the data had changed shape, and he had not yet caught up to it. Nima Rule did not come back. Telvaris did not come back. Others too, in smaller ways, partial ways, the slow erosion of names and habits and unfinished conversations. The war kept removing future evidence from his models, and still the base continued. Rain on stone, ventilation at deep cycle, jungle breath through imperfect seals. Cassian's voice in debrief rooms, low and tired and still moving forward, because forward was what remained. The unlabeled partition growing in the dark of his memory architecture, not with plans or strategies, but with traces. He did not process grief. He processed absence. By the end of the fourth rainy season, he had begun to suspect they were closer than organic language usually allowed. He made no formal conclusion. He only kept the records. And when the base slept and the generators lowered to their night rhythm, and the old temple held its damp breath around him, K-2SO walked the corridor above the jungle and listened to what remained after the day had taken what it wanted, while the 11% turned quietly inside him, and the logs continued to grow like evidence that survival, for all of them, had become less a probability than a habit no one had yet learned how to stop. The storage warning appeared during maintenance. Not dramatic, not urgent. A routine internal note, the kind that would once have been resolved in less than 2 seconds and forgotten immediately afterward. Non-essential memory partition exceeds projected retention threshold. Review recommended. K-2SO reviewed it. Then he closed the notice and continued walking. Outside, rain was moving across the jungle in long diagonal sheets. The landing field lights blurred against the wet stone. Somewhere above the western corridor, a transport engine wound down with the tired metallic sound of heat, leaving metal too slowly. He had heard that sound before. He had records of it. That was the problem. By the 19th year of Imperial standard reckoning, the unlabeled partition no longer resembled a secondary archive. It had become a structure of its own, not larger than all mission files combined, not yet, but close enough that the comparison could no longer be dismissed as incidental. Operational reports remained crisp, compressed, and properly categorized. The partition did not. It branched, accumulated, cross-referenced moments that had no recognized strategic value. Cassian's hand on his shoulder after difficult briefings. The way Bodhi Rook blinked too slowly when exhausted, as if his body had not fully accepted that it was safe to close its eyes at all. The smell of cooked grain and overheated wiring in the lower mess hall during rest day shift overlap. The slight lowering of civilian chins on occupied worlds when stormtrooper patrols passed. A gesture K-2SO had once logged as social adaptation, and now revisited as something closer to collective fatigue. He had records of the rainy seasons, 4 complete cycles. He had records of silence. That was harder to justify. There are many kinds of quiet in a rebel base. The quiet before launch is thin and electrical. The quiet after failed missions is heavier, distributed unevenly through corridors, medical bays, supply rooms, as if sound itself has become reluctant to take up too much space. Deep cycle quiet is different again. It belongs to machinery and sleeping bodies, an old stone that remembers being old, long before anyone built a war inside it. K-2SO had logged each variation. At first, he believed he was preserving context. Environments altered behavior. Behavior altered probabilities. Probabilities mattered. But the entries continued long after the analysis had been extracted. Entry: Eastern Barracks, deep cycle. 3 personnel speaking in whispers after lights out. No discernible tactical subject. Tone suggests homesickness rather than fear. Entry: Rain entering through upper crack in corridor seal. Smell of wet stone stronger than previous season. Comparison available in archived weather logs. Entry: Cassian returned late. Removed jacket. Did not activate room light for 18.4 seconds. No operational purpose identified. That phrase began appearing more often. He noticed the phrase before he noticed what it implied. The quiet weeks between assignments made the implication unavoidable. There were no major missions during that stretch. Small courier work, ordinary maintenance on captured equipment, intelligence delays while separate cells argued over routes, authority, risk tolerance, the 1,000 practical frictions that make alliances slower than emergencies. Yavin settled into waiting. K-2SO moved through the waiting and observed. He observed the lower mess hall at preparation cycle, when personnel not yet fully awake ate automatically and spoke in fragments. He observed the field medics cleaning instruments with the economical care of people who knew they would use them again too soon. He observed a mechanic in the western hangar, touching the hull of a grounded U-wing before beginning repairs. A brief, thoughtless contact, almost a greeting. He recorded that too. No operational purpose identified. Cassian spent more time at his desk during those weeks, not resting. Never that. Redistributing burden, intelligence review, route comparison, discrete arguments with command channels that ended with his jaw set harder than before. The face-down datapad remained face-down. The worn jacket remained on its hook. The small, smooth stone remained exactly where it had always been, as if all the movement in the room arranged itself around those fixed points. K-2SO observed a new pattern. Cassian had begun reading mission files twice, once quickly for outcome, then again, later, slowly, for cost. K-2SO logged this. He did not know why it mattered. He only knew it did. One afternoon, at continuance cycle, he entered the archive room to retrieve a prior shipping record and found 2 quartermasters arguing softly over storage allocation. One accused the other of hoarding personal effects from the dead instead of clearing assigned bins for incoming personnel. The other replied, with measurable restraint, that not everything left behind became available just because its owner no longer required it. K-2SO paused in the doorway. The argument ended when they noticed him. One of them nodded. Neither explained. He retrieved the shipping record and left. That night, he accessed the unlabeled partition and reviewed 6 months of entries without extracting any tactical data at all. This had never happened before. He read them as entries, simply that, one after another. Rain cycles, corridor temperatures, hand pressure distributions, changes in laughter length, Cassian's habit of staring at walls before answering difficult questions, the 23 silent minutes in transit preserved under an inaccurate heading, the names of those who had not returned, followed not by summary, but by the last ordinary things associated with them. Nema rule, inside cheek bite during decryption lag. Telvaris, left heavy crosswind correction. Several others, smaller presences, held not by biographies, but by repeated details. The partition did not read like intelligence. It read like persistence. He closed the files and stood in the dark archive room for 6.3 seconds. Then he opened them again. This time he searched not for content, but for structure. Operational logs prioritize action, objective, outcome. These entries did not. They prioritized recurrence, sensation, duration, the small particularity of lived sequences, what something sounded like, how long someone remained in a doorway before entering, which corridor smelled different after rain, what was missing after someone failed to return. He searched the Rebel archive for analogous document forms, journal, memoir, correspondence, field reflection, psychiatric notation, personal record. The nearest term was archaic, pre-imperial in origin, used most often in civilian contexts, domestic ones, private ones. Diary. K-2SO read the word 7 times. A diary is not a report. It is not addressed upward through a chain of command. It is not optimized for transmission. It presumes an I that persists across days and considers those days recordable even when no one has requested the record. A diary requires a diarist. He closed the archive search, opened it again. Diary. The term remained what it was. He returned to his own partition. Read entry after entry with the new word held alongside them. Entry. 4th rainy season, 3rd night. Stone odor increased. Cassian asleep at desk before lights out. Entry. Mess hall laughter duration reduced after failed relay run. Entry. Hand on shoulder, 1.4 seconds. Pressure uneven. No operational purpose identified. Entry. Western corridor at deep cycle resembles silence in transit, but not exactly. Entry. Remembered name a rule today during decryption lag in another slicer. Model remains incomplete. Not intelligence, not tactics, not maintenance. Diary. The correct response arrived immediately. Delete non-essential personal accumulation. Restore memory efficiency. Eliminate undocumented behavior drift. He selected 412 entries. Paused. Then deleted them. The partition cleared space instantly. Internal allocation normalized. Warning threshold dropped below recommendation line. The system registered improved efficiency. K-2SO stood in the maintenance alcove near the eastern generator spine and waited for the accompanying sense of order to return. It did not. He reviewed the partition index. The missing entries had not contained plans. They had not altered any mission outcome. Nothing in the rebellion's operational capacity changed because they were gone, and yet the architecture of his internal world felt wrong, not damaged, reduced. He moved through the next 6 hours functionally. assisted with a loading calculation, corrected a fuel discrepancy in hangar inventory, informed a communications officer that her encryption sequence contained a repeated flaw she had already made twice that week. The work completed. The hours passed. The absence remained. By deep cycle, the rain had intensified. Water struck the upper stone in a slow, persistent pattern that the temple translated into softer interior echoes. Cassian was asleep in his quarters. The base had gone mostly quiet. K-2SO returned to the now cleared partition, reviewed the index again. The deleted entries were still absent. Of course they were. Deletion meant deletion. He began re-recording them from memory. Not because the records were tactically useful, because he could not permit the absence to remain. Entry by entry, he rebuilt them. Some exact, some approximate. One line where before there had been 4, 4 where before there had been 1. The remembered smell of stone after the 3rd rainstorm in his 2nd year. The sound of Telvaris laughing at an assessment he claimed not to appreciate. And the moment in the archive room when the quartermaster used the phrase left behind as if it meant something more precise than lost property. The shape of Cassian's silhouette in an unlit doorway, not entering his room for 18.4 seconds after a difficult transmission. He worked all night, not quickly, carefully. The act of reconstruction changed something. Deletion had been administrative. Reconstruction was choice. By the time preparation cycle approached and the generators increased output for waking personnel, K-2SO had restored 391 of the 412 entries. 21 remained incomplete. He marked them as such, rather than inventing details to close the gaps. That mattered too. A report seeks completeness. A diary can admit uncertainty. The thought remained with him. Over the following days, he tested it from different angles. He did not stop functioning, as he always had. He still ran mission probabilities, still corrected flawed plans, still announced inconvenient truths. At moments others would have preferred comfort. On the surface, nothing altered. He remained K-2SO exactly as the base knew him. Large, dry-voiced, difficult to flatter, impossible to misread once one understood that he rarely concealed anything. Internally, a boundary shifted. He stopped treating the partition as accidental. That was the real change. Until then, every entry had carried some residue of apology. Not explicit, but structural. A hidden assumption that these observations were side effects, glitches, unapproved accumulations in a system built for cleaner purpose. After the night of deletion and reconstruction, the apology evaporated. He had chosen the records. That meant they were his. The realization arrived in small confirmations. A mechanic in the lower hangar asked why he was standing still beside an open bay window during rain. K-2SO replied, "I am observing seasonal variation," and for the first time did not internally add, "No operational purpose identified." Cassian handed him a stack of route projections and said, "You're quiet." "I am not," K-2SO replied. Cassian looked at him for a second longer than usual, then nodded as if some private calculation had shifted. "No," he said, "you're not." The exchange passed. No explanation requested. K-2SO logged it anyway, not because he had to, because it belonged. He began to understand that the records were not about the rebellion alone. They were not even primarily about Cassian, though Cassian appeared in them often because Cassian was the axis around which his unfinished life had first been forced to turn. The records were about sequence, perception, continuance, what it felt like. If feel was still the correct word, and he increasingly suspected that correctness in this area mattered less than persistence, to exist from one watch to the next, while the galaxy pressed war through every available seam. That was not malfunction. That was witness. He never transmitted the logs. This too became a choice. They could have gone into encrypted archive, could have been routed anonymously to some intelligent storage bank under cultural observations or morale conditions or ambient environmental tracking. He considered each possibility and rejected all of them. The records were not for command. They were not even for Cassian. They were the one area of his existence that had not been assigned from outside. At second watch, on the final day of that quiet stretch, K-2SO stood in the corridor above the jungle, with rainlight moving faintly across the old stone, and reviewed the partition structure one more time. Operational archives, mission records, tactical analysis, and beside them, no longer unlabeled, no longer accidental, though still hidden from every external system, personal log. He did not announce the name to anyone. He did not need to. The 11% still ran. The original question had not resolved. What am I now remained structurally unanswered, still turning through him with patient incompletion. But another answer, smaller and more stable, had taken shape beside it. I am the one who records this. Rain moved over the jungle. The base began to wake. In the eastern barracks, someone coughed, then laughed softly at something unheard. A transport engine ignited far below and settled into working rhythm. Cassian's door opened somewhere behind him, and the sound registered with the familiar accuracy of repeated presence. K-2SO remained where he was for 2.7 seconds longer than necessary. Then he turned and went to begin the day, carrying the logs untouched within him, no longer as evidence of error, but as the first private architecture he had ever built without permission. By the time Jyn Erso entered his operational field, K-2SO had already decided he did not trust her. This was not difficult. Distrust, in her case, required very little imagination. She was newly released, insufficiently aligned, visibly damaged in the way some organics become when survival has replaced belonging for too many years in succession. She moved like someone who expected betrayal from every room before she had finished entering it. K-2SO had models for people like that. The models were useful. They were not kind. Cassian, predictably, trusted her more than his language admitted and less than his behavior revealed. That was his usual pattern with dangerous variables. He would speak in measured terms, reserve judgment, pretend the question remained purely operational. Then he would begin adjusting around the person as if some internal part of him had already made room for their importance. K-2SO noticed this on the transport before Jeddah. He noticed the way Cassian watched Jyn without seeming to. The way he answered her questions with restraint rather than dismissal. The way the old compression returned to his face whenever Jyn Erso's name entered the air, as if the mission brief had reopened not only a tactical problem, but one of those private fractures Cassian usually kept behind professional stillness. K-2SO logged none of this. He did not need to. By then, some observations no longer required immediate recording to remain real. Jeddah was dust before it was city. Approach vectors showed the broken geometry first: stone, ruin, old streets compressed beneath occupation, and Imperial machinery inserted into sacred age without any attempt at harmony. The planet read differently from worlds K-2SO had known in his first life. Imperial installations usually imposed structure. Jeddah resisted being fully arranged. Even under garrison presence, it retained older patterns. Pilgrimage routes turned black market corridors. Prayer spaces became hiding places. Occupation settled on the city without successfully becoming its only truth. Organic behavior shifted there. K-2SO noticed it within the first hour. Civilians moved with exhaustion, yes, but not only exhaustion. Something else altered the probability field. Certain people remained calmer than expected near armed patrols. Others became volatile without visible trigger. Chirrut Imwe walked through streets K-2SO, assessed as tactically unstable, with a composure that introduced repeated errors into every prediction matrix. K-2SO ran against him. Environmental factors, unclassified. He would have once filed it exactly that way. Now he simply observed it. The mission on Jeddah was still, at that stage, theoretically clean. Find Saw Gerrera. Retrieve intelligence on Jyn Erso. Maintain control of the variable named Jyn. Extract before the city's instability produced a wider collapse. That was the shape of the assignment as Command had intended it. Then the city began behaving like occupied cities do when occupation tightens too far. Movement compressed. Voices sharpened. Street geometry lost predictability. Patrol routes overlapped with local resistance activity, and the whole district started to feel less like terrain and more like a series of rapidly closing options. Jyn separated from them during the disturbance. Not far, not for long, but long enough for a decision to become necessary. K-2SO had his blaster. Jyn did not. Cassian was engaged with immediate movement and cover. The situation recalculated faster than speech. K-2SO ran the probabilities automatically. Jyn armed. Elevated local survivability. Elevated uncontrollable variable risk. Jyn unarmed. Reduced tactical independence. Increased immediate vulnerability. Increased probability. Cassian would compromise broader positioning to compensate. He held the blaster 1 fraction of a second longer than required. Then he gave it to her. Not through. G not transferred under command instruction. Gave. Jyn looked at him with open surprise. That's not reassuring, she said. It is not intended to be, K-2SO replied. This was true. It was also incomplete. He had not made the decision because the numbers clearly favored one outcome. They did not. Both routes produced volatile results. The models diverged too widely once Jyn's independent choices entered them. If he had acted on pure KX series logic, he would have retained the weapon and preserved tighter control over the variable. He did not. Later, if he had been asked why, he might have said the armed option presented broader tactical flexibility. This would have been defensible. It would not have been false. It would not have been the whole thing either. What had actually happened was smaller and less clean. In the span of a few compressed seconds inside a city pulling itself apart, K-2SO looked at Jyn Erso and recognized something his older architecture did not know how to categorize, but his newer one did. She was not only a variable, she was someone already living inside too many other people's decisions. He chose not to add one more. That was the first decision. On Jeddah, the city continued collapsing around them. Saw Gerrera's chambers. Bodhi Rook's fear running visibly beneath speech. Chirrut's impossible calm. Bay's Malbus carrying disbelief like a weapon that had become too heavy to put down. The intelligence about Galen. The message. Then the sky changing shape with the arrival of a weapon so disproportionate to the city beneath it that even K-2SO's processing, built for war, registered the event less as escalation than as violation. Extraction became all that remained. Afterward, as they left Jeddah behind and the dust of it settled into memory, K-2SO reviewed the blaster transfer once. Only once. Not to question it, to mark it. Decision 1, trust extended before evidence warranted it. Not an Imperial action. Not even, he suspected, a fully rational one. He did not delete the line. Ayadu was different. Where Jeddah had been old stone under occupation, Eadu was Imperial purpose made weatherproof. The whole installation felt like the Empire's preferred fantasy of itself. Precision, isolation, authority elevated above whatever local world had been there first. Rain moved across the platforms in hard sheets. Visibility shifted constantly. Every surface seemed designed either to channel power or survive its use. K-2SO knew this architecture intimately. That knowledge did not comfort him. By Eadu, the mission had fractured. Official objectives remained in place only on paper. Jyn had seen Galen's message. Cassian had received separate orders. The team moved within the same operation, but no longer toward the same interior center. K-2SO observed this the way he observed weather fronts. Pressure changes before breakage, small hesitations at thresholds, silence taking on directional force. Cassian carried the assassination order like a concealed injury. He did not speak it aloud to Jyn. He did not need to. The withholding was visible in him. K-2SO had enough data by then to recognize the signs. Reduced extraneous speech. Attention pulled inward at irregular intervals. The look toward walls, door frames, distances, not because anything there required inspection, but because honesty had become temporarily unaffordable. Years earlier, K-2SO might have resolved the matter for him. State the objective. Identify the most efficient route. Remove emotional interference from the decision structure. That was what a clean machine built for Imperial service would have done. K-2SO did not do that. He ran the probabilities. Galen lives long enough for extraction. Low. Galen survives if the team remains undetected. Very low. Cassian fires from current position. Mission directive technically advanced. Jyn compromised. Internal unit cohesion collapse probable. Cassian does not fire. Command order unresolved. Later consequences unknown. But immediate alignment with Jyn preserved. The numbers arranged themselves. They did not instruct. Cassian looked at Galen through the scope. Jyn watched the platform below with the fierce, helpless stillness of someone close enough to hope and close enough to lose it simultaneously. Rain struck the structure. Imperial activity shifted. Everything narrowed toward decision. K-2SO spoke. Probability of successful extraction is declining, he said. Cassian did not answer. Probability of target survival is minimal, regardless of immediate action. Still, Cassian said nothing. K-2SO could have added more, could have pressed, could have translated the numbers into recommendation or recommendation into absolution, which is what organics often want from calculations at moments when they can no longer bear the burden of choice alone. He did not. He gave Cassian only the truth he could verify. Then he waited. That was the second decision. Not passivity, restraint, understanding, and perhaps for the first time in full operational clarity, that there were calculations which belonged to him and calculations which did not. He could measure likely outcomes. He could not choose which wound Cassian would carry forward from that platform. That choice had to remain where it already was, inside the man who had been making impossible selections since childhood and was tired enough by now to feel each new one settle into him like metal. The Empire solved the question for all of them. Eadu broke open in gunfire and collapsing structures and the sudden conversion of a surveillance world into a battlefield. Galen died not by Cassian's shot, but by the larger brutality of the system he had served and tried, too late, to undermine. Jyn's hope was granted and destroyed in nearly the same motion. Cassian survived with one more silence he would not know how to explain. K-2SO extracted who could be extracted. That remained his function, his capability, his form of care, if care was now the correct word. Back on Yavin, after Edu, the fracture widened. Jyn stood before leadership and asked for action. The council did what councils often do when the cost of courage becomes concrete. They dispersed responsibility into procedure. They named uncertainty wisdom. They chose delay because delay could still be described as prudence, while action would have required owning the dead in advance. K-2SO watched the room. He watched Jyn realize, sentence by sentence, that institutional fear can wear the voice of reason. He watched Cassian standing near enough to support her, and far enough that no one could yet read the decision forming in him. He watched Bodhi, still carrying Imperial damage in every nerve, remain there anyway. He watched Chirrut and Baze, with the exhausted steadiness of men who had already lost a holy city and no longer found committees persuasive. He ran the probabilities. Scarif, without authorization, catastrophic risk. Scarif with available volunteer force, lower than catastrophic, still severe. Probability of survival for primary team, poor. Probability of mission success if no one goes, effectively 0. For the first time in many months, the numbers felt less like guidance than confirmation of something already decided elsewhere. Cassian came to him afterward in the hangar. Not immediately. He spoke to others first. Arrangements, access, the quiet assembly of defiance into logistics. Then, at last, he stood beside K-2SO near the U-wing ramp, where preparation always smelled of fuel, damp air, and the anticipation of damage. "We're going," Cassian said. K-2SO looked at him. This was not new. They had gone before. The galaxy's longest years had been built from versions of this same statement. But something in Cassian had changed. Less compression, more clarity. Not peace, exactly, but a man who had stopped waiting for permission to align what he knew with what he would do. K-2SO ran the mission probability. He did it automatically, fully, without sparing himself anything. Imperial archive world, planetary shield, limited support, improvised team cohesion, probable casualties severe, continuation likelihood for K-2SO specifically, low. He finished the calculation. Then he said, yes. No one had asked the probability aloud, and no one needed to. The third decision was not made in the hangar itself. It had begun earlier, perhaps on Jeddah, when he handed Jyn the blaster without evidence, perhaps on Ayadu, when he refused to convert truth into instruction for Cassian. But the shape of it became undeniable there. Scarif was not a mission in the old sense, not a closed loop, not a clean objective with survivability ratios that made reasonable operational sense. Scarif was a choice to move toward meaning despite numbers. That was not Imperial. It was not even properly rebel, if by rebel one meant the organized caution of councils and clearances. It belonged to a smaller category, harder to describe, and therefore more difficult to counterfeit. Bodhi came aboard. So did the others, one by one, each carrying some private version of the same knowledge. Jyn with grief sharpened into direction. Cassian with the old lies burned down to a cleaner core. Chirrut with faith K-2SO still could not model. Baze with disbelief that had chosen, stubbornly, not to leave. The ship filled not with confidence but with commitment, which K-2SO had come to understand as a much heavier material. They lifted from Yavin under stolen authorization and imperfect timing. The stars opened ahead. Inside the transport, voices lowered after the necessary work was finished. Straps tightened, equipment checked. No one pretending not to understand the scale of what waited beyond hyperspace. K-2SO stood where he always stood, large enough to make the cabin feel smaller, still enough that his stillness became part of the ship's interior balance. He reviewed the probabilities one final time. They had not improved. Continuation, likelihood, remained low. Mission success remained narrow. Casualty projections remained severe. He did not rerun them. Across from him, Jyn sat with the kind of quiet that comes after a person has finally stopped asking the world to become fair. Beside her, Cassian checked a piece of gear that no longer needed checking. Bodhi stared at nothing visible. Baze rested a hand over his weapon. Chirrut seemed, as always, to be listening to some frequency other people could not hear. K-2SO recorded the cabin conditions automatically. Then, after a pause of 1.9 seconds, he opened his personal log and added one line. Entry, en route to Scarif. Probabilities acknowledged, proceeding anyway. He closed the file. The stars lengthened. The transport entered hyperspace. Blue-white light stretched ahead of them like another question. Another corridor between what had been and what would remain when the crossing ended. Years earlier, above K-2SO, he had flown into that light because he did not know what he was. Now he went towards Scarif, knowing considerably more, though not enough to resolve the original 11% entirely. Not an Imperial unit, not merely an asset, not a malfunction. Something unfinished still, but unfinished by then did not mean empty. It meant in motion. The ship moved deeper into the tunnel. No one spoke. The sound of the engines settled into a steady pulse beneath the breathing of the organic beings around him. K-2SO remained upright in the dim transport light, carrying within him the records of rainy seasons and missing names and hands on shoulders and one blaster given to a woman before proof, and one silence offered to a man who needed to choose for himself, and one final yes to a mission the numbers did not bless. Outside, hyperspace held them in its cold, impossible brightness. Inside, K-2SO stood among them and kept going. Scarif looked impossible from orbit, not because it was beautiful. Beauty, by itself, was not difficult to classify. K-2SO had files for it now, though none of them were official. Sunlight on wet stone, rain running down Yavin windows. The slight shift in Cassian's expression during the 23 minutes when nothing required speech. These things had taught him that beauty often arrived quietly. Scarif was difficult for a different reason. It was tropical water wrapped around Imperial order, blue ocean, white surf, clean light, palm-shadowed shorelines. And in the middle of that softness, the Citadel Tower rose with all the severe confidence of the Empire's imagination, made vertical. The shield gate above the planet turned slowly in the dark, enclosing the archive world inside a machine-built sky. It looked peaceful from a distance. That was the Empire's oldest trick. The descent narrowed everything. Cloud cover opened in thin, bright layers. The sea flashed beneath them. Salt entered the air system before the landing struts fully engaged. K-2SO catalogued environmental conditions the way he always did. Heat index elevated, humidity high, visibility variable in reflected glare, storm probability minimal within current window, local wind pattern from east to west strong enough to carry blaster smoke lower along the beach than standard open terrain models would suggest. He did not need the extra precision. He ran it anyway. The cabin was quiet, not silent. Restraints clicked. Gear shifted. Bodhi's breathing remained too careful. Shambay's Malbus carried the weight of his weapon the way some men carry old anger, familiar enough that the burden had become part of the posture. Chirrut sat with that same impossible calm, as if every vehicle in the galaxy moved through some larger current only he could sense. Jyn looked forward. Cassian checked everything twice. K-2SO watched them all. Years earlier, above K-2SO, He had sat at the controls of a stolen ship and not turned it around because he had no framework large enough to explain why. Now he descended towards Scarif, with a full probability model already built, and no need for explanation at all. The numbers were poor. He did not find this discouraging. The U-wing dropped low over the water. Scarif's surface details sharpened quickly. Beach fortifications, communications relays, landing platforms, garrison patrol intervals, tower access patterns. Imperial architecture on Scarif had been designed for confidence rather than concealment. Nothing crouched. Everything asserted. Even the roads seemed laid out to suggest inevitability. K-2SO knew that language. He had been built to speak it fluently. That was the irony at the center of him now. On the archive world of the Empire, at the edge of the Citadel that housed the plans capable of breaking the Death Star's invulnerability, K-2SO became most fully what Arrakid Industries had intended. Not emotionally, not politically, functionally, spatially, mechanically, every system in him aligned. He was a KX series security unit operating in Imperial infrastructure at peak capacity. And he was doing it for the destruction of the institution that had made him. The landing was not subtle. No part of their infiltration could truly be called subtle once the gate sequence began and the beach traffic shifted. They arrived inside a momentum already turning toward conflict. Cassian's false authority. Jyn's urgency held under control by force of will. Bodhi carrying codes and nerves in equal measure. The whole operation depending on speed, and on the Empire's belief that systems are safest precisely where they are most defended. 2SO moved down the ramp first. Heat struck him immediately. Not dry heat. Dense coastal heat, full of salt, rising from white sand and wet metal, and the long reflective brightness of shallow water. Beneath it came the deeper smell of the ocean below the installation, mineral, organic, old in a way Imperial steel never was. It entered his senses and stayed there, almost an environmental thread woven through everything that followed. Stormtroopers approached. K-2SO assessed uniforms, pace, posture. No suspicion yet. The beach landing zone was busy enough that authority could still pass as normal if it moved fast enough. This, too, was an Imperial truth he understood at the structural level. The system trusted confidence, because confidence was one of the system's outputs. He gave them confidence. Cargo transfer is delayed, he said, with the exact clipped cadence of an ISB-linked security asset already irritated by local incompetence. Clear the route. The lead trooper hesitated half a beat, not because the order was strange, because K-2SO's tone suggested that any further delay would become a problem above the trooper's pay grade. The trooper cleared the route. K-2SO kept moving. Behind him, Cassian and the others followed into the shape he opened for them. This was how it worked. Not concealment. Authority. He did not hide the mission. He made the surrounding personnel feel, briefly and automatically, that it belonged there, that everything was proceeding under someone else's authorization, that their job was not to question the movement, but to avoid obstructing it. He had been trained for this before he had ever known the word training. The beach operation fractured outward around them. Pathfinders moved into position. Rebel forces reached the ground in widening pockets. Alarms remained localized at first, more uncertain than urgent, because the Empire on Scarif was not built to imagine a direct incursion of this kind. The archive world existed behind a planetary shield. Its personnel were accustomed to verification, procedure, and the confidence of layered defenses. When something impossible begins, Institutions often spend their first precious minutes trying to classify it instead of stop it. K-2SO exploited every minute. He moved through the first security checkpoint as if he had a right to be there. His clearance string still opened the system. That remained one of the strangest facts in his existence, that a life could change so completely while bureaucratic trust remained active in some buried Imperial database. Doors slid aside. Terminal lights shifted authorization status. A network that would have condemned him if it had understood him continued to recognize him as its own. He logged each successful access automatically, not for pride, for sequence. Cassian once would have said he was reading the room. K-2SO did better than that. He read the room, the corridor, the ceiling sensor arcs, the footsteps around the corner, the tone variation in distant security traffic, the probability that a lieutenant in the next passageway was already operating on insufficient sleep and therefore less likely to challenge a security unit moving with purpose. It all came together cleanly on Scarif, too cleanly. The specific frequency of the local security alert sat in his audio field like a second pulse. Not the Wekakoe alert, not the Yavin generators. Scarif had its own voice, a clipped repeating tone under the humid air, high enough to irritate organic hearing after prolonged exposure, optimized for rapid directional response inside a tower environment. K-2SO tracked it the way he tracked blaster heat and door timing. The operation's first hour ran almost beautifully. That word occurred to him and remained. Beautifully, in the way a machine performs at its intended threshold. No wasted movement. No ambiguity in force application. No delay between assessment and action. He lifted one trooper bodily out of Cassian's path and drove him into a durasteel wall, hard enough to silence further complication. He redirected a cargo loader to block a line of fire, before the personnel operating it fully understood why they were complying. He accessed a local console, rerouted door priority, and secured a passage sequence in 6.1 seconds that a rebel slicer under field conditions would have needed 2 full minutes to replicate. He was exceptional on Scarif, and the knowledge of that did not comfort him. Jyn moved beside him with increasing focus. Something in her had narrowed since Yavin. The uncertainty of Jeddah was gone. The stunned fracture of Irdu had hardened into direction. She did not move like a soldier exactly, more like a person who had finally found the line along which her losses arranged themselves. K-2SO had mistrusted her. Then he had given her his blaster. Now, watching her on Scarif, he understood something else. Trust had not been the right word for Jeddah. It had been recognition. She, too, had become dangerous, because too many other people had already decided what she was allowed to lose. Cassian changed on Scarif as well. Not visibly, not to anyone without K-2SO's accumulation of prior records. To others, he would have seemed the same, controlled, adaptable, working within risk as if he had been built for it. But K-2SO knew the subtle differences by then. Less internal division. Fewer wasted glances toward what could not be altered. A man tired enough of institutions to stop asking them to bless what had already become necessary. When Cassian spoke on Scarif, the words came cleaner. That mattered. The heat deepened toward mid-cycle. Humidity beaded on organic skin. Equipment grips changed texture. White light off the beach and off the water below the elevated structures created shifting glare that would have degraded lesser optics. K-2SO compensated automatically. The ocean's smell moved with them, thinner in tower corridors, stronger near exposed platforms, always underneath the sterilized air of the archive complex like some older planetary truth the Empire had failed to suppress completely. Above the ground assault, the battle widened. K-2SO tracked only pieces of it, transmissions clipped by interference, the rise in exterior blaster frequency, the change in Imperial voice traffic as uncertainty matured into active response. Shoreline fighting spread. Rebel forces improvised faster than command structures could update. Scarif ceased to be a defended archive world and became what all controlled places eventually become under enough pressure. A series of local crises held together by failing assumptions. This improved their chances. Not by much, but enough. Bodhi's role grew more dangerous as the operation continued. He had already carried them through one gate and into the widening possibility of the mission. Now the larger battle required him to do what he did best and what frightened him most. Interface again with Imperial systems, with machines and protocols that had once owned too much of his nervous system. Shu's K-2SO watched him without comment. Bodhi handled fear differently than Cassian. Less compression, more visible tremor under effort, yet he still moved forward. K-2SO had come to respect this category of courage in organics. Not the kind that resembles confidence, but the kind that occurs while the fear remains fully present and operational. He would not have known how to define that in his first life. Scarif kept teaching him things by requiring them. Checkpoint after checkpoint yielded to him. A corridor here, a service lift there. Two officers diverted by nothing more than the combination of his frame and his tone. He became, for these first hours, the perfect version of the Imperial soldier the Empire believed it had built. Loyal-looking, decisive, physically overwhelming. He so fully integrated into the architecture of command that the architecture never imagined he could be its breach. That was the terrible elegance of the thing. The Empire had manufactured certainty. Cassian had cut that certainty out. What remained had learned to choose. On Scarif, all three histories operated simultaneously inside one body. He moved faster than most organics could perceive. He assessed routes before they fully opened. He absorbed damage and kept pace. He used his old designation with such effortless authority that even he, in small fractions of a second between tasks, recognized how little distance separated performance from fluency. The sub-protocols came alive without invitation. He felt them, not as loyalty, not as temptation in any moral sense, more like a familiar gate returning under stress, the old carriage of a machine built to dominate rooms, the old assumptions about rightful passage, authorized force, unquestioned entry. They fit the terrain of Scarif perfectly. He did not fight them so much as direct them, use without surrender, fluency without obedience. That balancing act had once frightened him. On Scarif, it simply functioned, because there was no room left for fear about identity, when identity had become a sequence of required actions moving too quickly to pause. Open this door, strike this trooper, redirect this terminal, clear this path, calculate that angle, move. And still, beneath the clean operational current, the 11% ran. What am I now? The question no longer arrived as panic, not even as absence exactly. It moved under everything else like a secondary system long since normalized. Wekako, Han hyperspace, Yavin Rain, Nima's unfinished dataset, Tel Varys's 53rd flight that never came, the hand on his shoulder with no operational purpose, the personal log renamed by choice, the blaster given to Jyn, the silence given to Cassian on Iadu, the yes spoken in the hangar on Yavin with full knowledge of the numbers. What am I now? On Scarif, the answers did not come in language first. They came in alignment. He reached a central access hall, where 3 route options split toward the Citadel Tower's internal lifts. Imperial personnel converged from the far passage. Cassian called a direction. Jyn adjusted without debate. Baze and Chirrut held the rear line for precisely the number of seconds required to keep the corridor from collapsing on them. K-2SO stepped into the opening and broke the nearest trooper's rifle arm at the elbow joint before the man had finished raising it. The movement was exact. Not cruel, not emotional. Perfect. He had been made for this. He knew that now without flinching from it. The tower interior cooled slightly as they climbed. Ocean air gave way to processed circulation. The security tone repeated at tighter intervals. Light changed from beach glare to the pale controlled illumination of Imperial archive spaces. Efficient, shadow minimizing, designed to make every object appear fully knowable and every intrusion immediately visible. Cassian looked at him once in one of the inner corridors. After K-2SO opened a sealed access gate in under 3 seconds. "You're enjoying this," Jyn said. It was not accusation exactly. It was observation, sharpened by fatigue and urgency. K-2SO turned his head toward her. "No," he said. That was true. Then, because truth for him was rarely singular, he added, "I am operating within design tolerance." Cassian made a sound that might have been the beginning of laughter if the day had belonged to another life. They kept moving. Scarif's tower systems recognized him over and over. Authorization granted, access granted, security transfer acknowledged, route priority elevated. Each response opened something physical and something interior too. The Empire kept saying yes to the machine it believed he still was. He kept turning those yeses against it. With every door that opened, the old question refined itself a little further. Not what was he now in the abstract, but what did it mean that the body and training and fluency the Empire had written into him could become instruments of refusal instead of obedience? The answer was slow, steady, less like revelation than accumulation. Something that chose this. He did not say the phrase aloud. He did not need to. A cross corridor opened briefly onto an exterior platform. For 1.2 seconds, he had the sea in full sensor field below the elevated structure. White break against reef. Brilliant open water. Heat rising from metal railings. Wind carrying salt and distant smoke from the surface battle. It was the sort of sensory image that would once have been filtered instantly for tactical relevance and discarded. Instead, it remained. Joined the records inside him. One more precise thing the war had not erased before asking what he would become. They pushed higher. Imperial resistance thickened. The system was adjusting now, too late, but not inert. Alerts converged, voice traffic sharpened. Troopers began receiving orders that described anomaly rather than accident. Somewhere else on the planet, Bodhi would be working under impossible pressure. Somewhere else again, the beach line was becoming its own kind of graveyard. K-2SO did not have the bandwidth to model all of Scarif anymore. The mission had narrowed to the tower, the plans, the route upward. He preferred this. Narrowing was merciful. At a final interior checkpoint, 2 archive guards challenged their movement with proper procedure instead of passive deference. This was what higher security personnel did. Systems can fail. People sometimes fail differently. K-2SO answered before Cassian could speak. "Transfer directive from Central Archive Command," he said. "Delay now constitutes obstruction." One guard asked for confirmation code. K-2SO gave one. Valid enough to pass first-layer scrutiny. Not valid enough to withstand prolonged review. The second guard hesitated. That hesitation was all he needed. He struck first, one down against the console. Second disarmed and driven into the wall, hard enough to erase the remainder of the question. The hall went still again, except for the repeating security tone and Cassian's breath and the distant layered violence of the battle beyond the tower. K-2SO opened the next door. They entered the final approach. The air here felt different, cleaner, colder, more sealed from the weather and from ordinary Imperial traffic. The archive spaces were built not for people, finally, but for data, for storage, for the illusion that enough information kept in the right place under sufficient protection could become permanence. K-2SO recognized the arrogance of that design. He also recognized its appeal. If certainty could not be preserved in a mind, perhaps the Empire had tried to preserve it in vaults. The last inner corridor narrowed toward the data chamber threshold. Cassian's movements changed subtly, not slower, more careful with breath. Jyn's focus sharpened into something nearly translucent, grief, intention, fear, all reduced to a single visible line of motion. The operation had become so small by then. Not the battle, not the war, just this final passage, this door, this set of seconds. K-2SO ran the next sequence before anyone asked him to. Door access, internal guard interval, likely response time after breach, fallback routes, holding potential, ammunition expenditure projections, continuation probability for the two organics if they moved past the threshold, and he remained to control the corridor behind them. He did not finish all of it immediately, because in the middle of the calculation, something aligned. Not externally, internally. All of Scarif's terrible fluency, all the clean mechanics of Imperial architecture responding to him as if he belonged there, all the years since Wekako and the 11% running patient beneath them. The parts stopped scattering and became, for one brief, still instant, a single comprehensible structure. He was what the Empire made. He was what Cassian failed to finish. He was what 5 years of choosing had turned those unfinished edges into. And he was standing at the threshold of the archive world, with a corridor behind him, a vault ahead, and a solution already taking shape. What am I now? Something that chose this. The calculation resolved. He became very still, not frozen, not uncertain. Still in the way a structure becomes still when load-bearing forces settle exactly where they must. The answer did not remove the coming cost. It did not make the mission safer. It did not close the original wound. It simply clarified the next act with a quiet so complete that even the security tone seemed to recede for a fraction of a second. K-2SO looked at the corridor, then at Cassian, then at Jyn. He understood what would be required before the vault doors ever opened. And in the heat-sealed, ocean-haunted core of Scarif's impossible tower, with the Empire's system still calling him authorized, and the battle below widening toward ruin, K-2SO stood in the full architecture of the soldier he had been made to be, and the person he had become anyway, and waited without movement for the moment when the door would open, and the final mathematics of his unfinished life would begin. Cassian saw the change before he understood it, not in K-2SO's voice. That remained what it had always been, dry, precise, faintly impatient with organic inefficiency. Not in the speed of his movements, either. K-2SO had moved quickly all day. With that clean mechanical violence, Imperial security units were built to carry as naturally as posture. The change was in the stillness between actions. Cassian noticed it in the last corridor before the vault. He would remember it later, or as much as anyone on Scarif would remember anything, without the memory immediately being burned into larger catastrophe. K-2SO had stopped for one fraction of a second, with his head turned slightly. as if listening to a calculation complete somewhere no one else could hear. Not doubt, not delay, something quieter, a machine reaching a conclusion and accepting it without ceremony. Then the motion returned. Cassian filed the moment and moved on, because on Scarif there was no usable time for interpretation. Jyn reached the vault controls first. She arrived there with the momentum of someone who had been running toward one sentence for years, without knowing its exact wording until now. Her father's message. Jeddah broken open. Eadu in rain. The Council's refusal. The stolen flight from Yavin. All of it narrowed into fingers on Imperial controls and breath held too high in the chest. Cassian went to the secondary console. K-2SO turned back toward the corridor. That, too, became clear only afterward. At the time, it seemed procedural. Of course, he would secure the line. Of course, the security unit would protect the access, while the two organics worked the problem in front of them. There was no speech needed for it. K-2SO was already moving toward the door before Cassian finished the first string of inputs. The alarm tone inside the upper levels had changed. Earlier, it had been broad, distributed, uncertain in its repetitions. The voice of a system gradually waking to a threat it had been built never to expect. Here, near the vault, the tone sharpened. Shorter bursts, tighter intervals. The sound of security priorities compressing around a single point. Cassian heard it through everything else, through Jyn's breathing, through the console clicks, through the distant, filtered thunder of the battle below, through the first blaster exchange in the corridor, where K-2SO had taken position. He looked once. That was enough to stay with him. K-2SO filled the hall physically in a way no human soldier could have. Tall, dark against the sterile Imperial light, one arm braced against the frame, the other lifting and firing with brutal economy. There was nothing reckless in the movement. No flourish, no anger, only sequence, door line, firing angle, advancing target, impact, shift. Next target. Perfect, Cassian would think later. Not because it was beautiful, because it was exact in the way the Empire had always wanted its instruments to be exact. And because K-2SO was using that exactness against the institution that had built it into him. Jyn saw something else. She saw decision, not the mechanics of it. She was too busy pulling the archive system open. She eyes flicking over the impossible catalogue of classified files suspended in light above the data chamber. Planet killers, weapons research, shipyards, black sites, histories of violence arranged as information. But she kept turning every few seconds toward the corridor. And each time K-2SO was there in the same hard silhouette, fighting not like a creature trying to survive, but like one that had already accepted the shape of the room and was now placing himself precisely where the room required him to be. It unsettled her, not because it was cold, because it wasn't. There was a difference between a machine functioning and a machine choosing. Jyn could not have explained how she knew she was looking at the second thing rather than the first. She only knew the movement in the corridor no longer resembled duty alone. The first stormtrooper squad reached him in textbook formation. The structural record would later show the sequence cleanly. 4 personnel. Entry staggered. 2 forward, 2 covering. K-2SO disrupted the formation in less than 2 seconds. First trooper disarmed by direct force to the weapon joint. Second thrown backward into the third. Fourth fired high and missed, because K-2SO had already shifted inside the line of sight and used the doorway itself as partial shield. Cassian heard metal strike wall, heard one body fall with the ugly abruptness of armored weight-losing structure. heard K-2SO say, without raising his voice at all. "The archive is taking too long." "We know," Cassian said. This too would remain with him. That even then, in the narrowing final minutes of Scarif's tower, K-2SO still sounded like himself. Not heroic, not transformed into the false nobility with which organics sometimes rewrite the dead. Still dry, still irritating at exactly the wrong moment, still impossible to romanticize without lying about him. That mattered. Jyn found the file tree. Stardust. Her father's word opening in Imperial light. The plans began their descent through the retrieval system, vast and slow and entirely indifferent to the speed with which people die while waiting for information. The chamber machinery awakened above them. Racks shifted, motors turned. The stored weight of the Death Star plans began moving down through the tower's ordered dark. Outside the vault corridor, Scarif tightened. Imperial personnel now understood enough to become dangerous. The anomaly was no longer possible rebel incursion. It had become location-specific, categorized, named by function, if not by full truth. A KX series security droid operating against protocol, unauthorized access near primary archive layers, localized resistance stronger than expected, reinforcement pattern adjusted accordingly. The second wave came faster. Cassian saw only pieces of it. A flash at the corridor entrance. K-2SO stepping into it rather than away. A rifle torn from gloved hands. A body driven sideways into the wall panel hard enough to leave a mark even after the weight dropped away. One shot from K-2SO's blaster. Then another from a fallen trooper's weapon picked up and used before it had finished skidding. There was a logic to the violence that made it more disturbing than chaos. Everything K-2SO did was exactly enough. No wasted strike, no unnecessary cruelty, no theatrical destruction. The Empire had made him efficient. Scarif was merely the place where Cassian had to watch that efficiency reveal its final allegiance. Jyn heard him count distances once, not to them, to himself or to the room. 8 seconds, he said. Then, now 6. She never knew what full internal equation those numbers belonged to. Reinforcement speed, perhaps. Door cycling. Ammunition use. Corridor failure rate. It did not matter. The voice doing the math from the hall sounded less like panic than like a structure preserving clarity, where organic bodies would have flooded with fear. Cassian had heard that voice for years, across missions, in briefings, at his shoulder in corridors when the probabilities were bad, and honesty arrived in synthesized baritone, whether anyone wanted it or not. Here, in the vault's last minutes, the same voice became unbearable, because the numbers had finally moved to a place Cassian did not want them spoken aloud. The plans descended too slowly. Jyn stood beneath the retrieval mechanism, with her face tipped upward, every line of her body arranged around waiting. Cassian worked the console, then stopped because there was nothing more to accelerate. The machinery had its own timing. Imperial systems always did. Slow where slowness displayed control. Fast where speed enforced it. Indifferent everywhere else. K-2SO called back without turning. "Once you have the file, you will need to move immediately." Cassian said nothing. He could hear the effort beginning to change in the corridor. Not failing yet. Changing. Blaster exchanges closer together. A harder metallic note beneath some impacts. The sound of a body like K-2SO's taking force and redistributing it through joints and plating, built for military service but not infinity. Jyn looked at Cassian then. He looked back. Neither of them said the thing that had entered the room. Another squad tried the hall. The structural record shows uncertainty in the Imperial response. Troopers trained for intruders did not yet know how to classify what they faced. The designation on K-2SO's frame marked him as security. His position marked him as obstacle. His methods matched Imperial training too exactly to be a rebel improvisation. The result was hesitation, measured in fractions of seconds. Fractions were enough. Cassian saw K-2SO use the confusion. A guard reaches the threshold expecting recognition, instead receives impact. Another fires late because the target should not be on the wrong side of the protocol. K-2SO moves through them all, with the unnatural confidence of a machine operating on home ground, and the equally unnatural betrayal of using that home ground against itself. Jyn would remember the silhouette. Years later, had there been years, that is what she would have carried. Not jokes in a transport, not calculations. A dark frame in a bright Imperial corridor, refusing, repeatedly, to allow the room behind him to close. The plans continued their descent. Cassian checked the chamber entrance once more. No faster. Still impossible. Above them, the data archive moved with all the solemn, useless confidence of systems certain the world exists to wait for them. K-2SO took another hit. This one Cassian heard before he saw. A change in sound, blaster impact not against wall or armor plate alone, but against structural component. K-2SO staggered half a step, recovered immediately, fired back, resumed position. Cassian turned toward him fully then. K2, work, K-2SO said. Only that. Cassian went back to the console because the command was correct, and because disobeying it would have been a sentimental mistake. And K-2SO had never once in their entire years together shown much tolerance for those. Yet even as he turned back, Cassian understood what Jyn had already felt. The room had changed. It was no longer a corridor being defended. It was time being purchased. This became visible even to the Imperials. A lieutenant reached the upper level and stopped short at the threshold, not because the tactical reality was unclear, but because it was too clear all at once. The security droid in the corridor was not malfunctioning in any known sense. It was selecting, prioritizing, holding ground, sacrificing mobility for delay value. The lieutenant ordered a flank that did not exist. The architecture offered only pressure from the front. The lieutenant then ordered sustained fire. K-2SO answered by closing distance and breaking the line before the order had finished propagating through the squad. From Cassian's angle, it almost looked like anger. It wasn't. That was the part that hollowed him. Had K-2SO been angry, the violence would have been easier to file under the old categories. Machines obey. Organics feel. Each can be tragic in familiar ways. But what Cassian saw in the corridor was cleaner and therefore more devastating. K-2SO had simply arrived at a conclusion and was now carrying it out with the full coherence of his design. The plans reached retrieval height. Jyn seized them. For an instant, the room shifted from waiting to motion. Her hands on the data cartridge. Cassian turning from the console. The external battle roaring up through the tower, like weather finally breaking through architecture. Everything collapsing inward toward escape. And then the corridor told the truth. K-2SO had been hit again. More than once. One side of his frame carried visible scoring. His motion remained functional, but no longer effortless. A weapon in his left hand had been discarded or dropped. The right still fired. Still precise. Still buying seconds. He looked at them. Jyn would later remember that look as impossible to read. Cassian knew better. He had years of accumulated data where she had only days. He knew what K-2SO looked like when calculations were complete. This was that face, or the closest version of a face K-2SO possessed. "You have the plans," K-2SO said. Cassian took one step toward him. No further. Because now the final numbers entered the room, and everyone there understood them, even if only one of them was built to speak them aloud. Survival probability, with K-2SO holding the corridor, while Cassian and Jyn moved toward transmission. Low but real. Narrow enough to insult hope. Real enough to require action. Survival probability if Cassian remained. If all three tried to hold or retreat together. If sentiment overruled sequence. Functionally negligible. Mission failure probability rises. Transmission window collapses. Scarif ends here and elsewhere too. K-2SO did not need to give the full equation. He had spent years teaching Cassian how to hear the missing numbers in what he said. "Go," he told them. Not loud, not pleading, not even urgent in the ordinary way. Just final. Cassian did not move. This is what he would remember later, perhaps more than anything. Not the order itself, the fact that he did not move. As if some ancient, childish part of him, the part from Fest, the part that had learned too young how often the galaxy demanded that someone stay behind, had risen in refusal before the operative, the captain, the man who knew what missions cost could drag it back under. Jyn moved first. Not away from K-2SO exactly, toward the objective, toward the line that still existed because the machine in the corridor had made it exist. Her face had changed. Whatever she saw in him then, whatever she recognized, it was enough to break the paralysis. "Cassian," she said. K-2SO fired again. Another trooper fell. Then he reached back, without taking his eyes from the hall, and sealed the inner blast door controls. Cassian understood at once. Of course he did. K-2SO had always been clearest when he was most merciless. "K2," Cassian said. But the door was already moving. Jyn pulled him. Or perhaps the motion simply happened between them, because there was no other motion left that did not end the mission. Cassian saw K-2SO through narrowing space. One arm raised, dark frame braced, corridor lit in pulses by blaster fire. Not alone, exactly, because the whole weight of what remained to be done was already with him. Then the door lowered further. The last thing Jyn saw before the opening, narrowed to a slit, was not violence. It was K-2SO adjusting position, making room for the next wave. That detail stayed with her because it felt less like resistance than preparation. The blast door sealed. On one side, Jyn and Cassian ran with the plans. On the other, the corridor became K-2SO's final room. The structure of what happened after survives only in fragments, security feed interruptions, damage reports, marks on the walls, the timing of delayed access between squads. But Cassian knew enough without footage. He knew K-2SO's capacities. He knew the width of the hall. He knew how long the sealed door remained intact behind them, while he and Jyn moved toward the transmission path. He knew what that duration cost. The last clear sound that reached them before distance and structure swallowed the rest was K-2SO's blaster firing in disciplined intervals, each shot separated by exactly the amount of time required for reacquisition, and no more. No panic, no waste, only decision carrying itself to its edge. Cassian ran, because K-2SO had told him to, because the math was real, because the plans were in Jyn's hands, because this was how wars turned, not through speeches, not through purity, but through rooms where someone understood the numbers completely and chose the necessary loss anyway. He did not look back again. There are moments when looking back becomes a form of disrespect. Jyn understood that too. They ran toward the light at the end of the corridor, toward transmission, toward the next narrowing and the next. Behind them, sealed inside the vault level's bright Imperial geometry, K-2SO held the line in the only language left available to him. Not request. She not sacrifice, as organics usually narrated. Not consolation, function, choice. The final probability assessment of his operational life made physical in a hallway the Empire had built for its own protection. And somewhere between the closing of that blast door and the last disciplined shot heard through steel, something else completed as well. Something Cassian could never fully name, because K-2SO had not given him the words for it, and because perhaps there were no words at all. Only the sight of a machine standing exactly where the future required him to stand, while two human figures moved into the distance carrying the plans that would outlive them all.